So, Aisa Torres.
And we just want to recognize we've been joined by Council Member Lincoln Ressler.
So, if you'd like to begin.
My name is Renee Kitt. I'm a resident of Elliott Chelsea Houses, which has been allegedly slated for demolition because we allegedly voted for it. Or should I say, there was a survey taken. There are no conditions in our home that justify demolition. So one thing I want to say, no demolition. We are being portrayed as intergenerational poverty. That is inaccurate. We are a community, a mixed income community, primarily BIPOC residents who live together, making New York a diverse community. We are not to be a sacrifice zone, to be the continued trend of enriching related companies to the detriment of NYCHA developments. We are low and moderate income. We help to run this city. We don't run, we stayed. Hudson Yards was built on the back of George Washington Carver houses, Frederick Douglass houses, Jefferson houses, and DeWitt Clinton and East River. We do not plan to have the Elliott Chelsea or Fulton houses be the next sacrifice zone to enrich a man that is already worth billions. As I said before, it was a survey. To this day, everyone keeps saying, we voted. We did not. We do not know how Elliott, Chelsea, Chelsea Addition, and Fulton have voted, or should I say, the survey totals for each development. We have asked our city council member, our state, we have asked repeatedly of many people. No one is willing. We are not to be sacrificed. You continue the trend of using Black and brown communities to build this city, thinking we are disposable. We are not. We are not the Indians on the reservation. That is what is going to be. We are not to be sacrificed. I am tired of it. Everyone keeps saying we're not doing the same thing. It continues. I end with one thing: no demolition. We want to know what happened. We are always being told things after it. I hear the word resident. Resident, as in the TA. There are thousands of residents in Elliott, Chelsea, Chelsea Addition, and Fulton. We are not being listened to, and people are refusing to hear. I do not enjoy being gaslit by my city council member, Eric Botcher. I do not enjoy when he dehumanizes us, calling us intergenerational poverty, and our TA presidents are sitting right there or standing right there listening to him. They are part of what he is discussing and what he is talking about. We are human beings. We are not to be used to make this man any richer than he is. I end with one thing: no demolition. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to ask questions after all the panel testifies.
Good morning. I thank the chairwoman and all the members of this committee for holding this hearing. My name is NYCHA Torres, and I am the Resident Association President of Alfred E. Smith Houses. I am a sitting member of CCOP, the Citywide Council of Presidents. This needs assessment needs to be done, again, by the residents. The issue is, and this is something that I've been for the last 2 years when I was on my campaign to be the chairperson of NYCHA, is who better knows, as one of my former residents who chaired my grievance committee, knows what is wrong in our apartments and in our buildings that the residents who live there. To hire people to come into our developments who don't have a clue, don't ask the questions, and really don't do what needs to be done to do an assessment is totally unconscionable. I am clear, as the president of Alfred E. Smith Houses, what our needs are, what needs to be finished, what needs to be done. Right now, I have a boiler replacement. And just for the record, we were allocated from the state $31 million. They put in a contract for $21 million. And every time we go into a meeting and I ask for something on behalf of the residents, oh, there's no money. And I say, find my $10 million. Because we lobbied for that money, the residents of Alfred E. Smith. And so I say all of this. I'm not the only resident association president who's going through this. And when we really complain and talk about what needs to be done, no one is listening to us. And they need to, the assessment has to come from the residents, it has to come from us, and it has to be a dual venture where the residents with management go through every aspect of the development and figure out what exactly is it that you need. Not what somebody who got hired that's never been in our property to decide, oh, they need this, they need that, they need this. No, we know exactly what we need. And the most crucial thing for Alfred E. Smith and like other developments that are the same age is we need our piping system to be replaced. The same way that the city, all the way from South Ferry to 14th Street, east to west, is changing the pipes in the streets, they need to do that in our developments that are over 50 years old. I thank you for this opportunity to express the needs, the real needs that the residents in public housing have.
Thank you, Ms. Torres.
Good morning, Chair Aviles and members of the committee. Thank you so much for holding this session. My name is Sophie Cohen, and I'm a staff attorney with the New York Legal Assistance Group's Public Housing Justice Project. We are the first team of attorneys and legal workers in New York City dedicated solely to representing public housing tenants and residents. We will submit written testimony, but I would like to offer this testimony now. And we offer this testimony to remind City Council of the following: that regardless of the expected costs over the next 20 years, the New York City Housing Authority remains responsible for maintaining its buildings and ensuring that all NYCHA residents, our clients included, are afforded safe and habitable homes that they can live in with dignity. The PNA and the expected high cost of necessary work are not an excuse to not provide repairs, to not turn over vacant apartments, of which there are at least 3,300, and it is not an excuse or a rationale to privatize public housing. NYCHA's PNA is not a justification for its failure to provide safe and healthy housing to current residents and New Yorkers in need. As a landlord, NYCHA is obligated to ensure that its residents' apartments and buildings are safe and livable. Just to remind everybody, NYCHA holds 7% of the rental housing in the city, and NYCHA is home to at least 500,000 New Yorkers. This is more than the population of large cities like Atlanta and Miami. That said, when residents in NYCHA raise very real concerns, instead of conducting repairs in a reasonable time or predictable manner, NYCHA staff look for any opportunity to close out repair tickets without actually fixing the problem. Often we see NYCHA staff leaving notes at our clients' doors claiming that they weren't home when they in fact were. NYCHA staff regularly point to the PNA as an excuse for why it cannot fix even simple problems, and we see this all the time. You've already heard from NYCHA residents what they're experiencing, but I will share a couple examples that we've seen with our clients. In one holdover proceeding in Manhattan Housing Court, a NYCHA attorney refused to agree to replace a broken sink in a resident's apartment. This is a cheap fix and a necessary part of a home. They refused to do this relying on the P&A and claiming that they would be fired if they agreed to provide a sink. Similarly, one of our clients has been waiting for a functional kitchen sink for over a year. NYCHA removed the old sink and has yet to install a permanent one despite repeated requests and our requests to attorneys within NYCHA. In yet another example of a very simple fix, we have a client whose mailbox lock has been broken for months. This means that her legal and personal mail has been left unsecured, and even though her mailbox can be fixed with a single screw, NYCHA has refused, telling her that she has to wait until they have the money to replace all the mailboxes in the entire development. And these are just a few examples of many. I also want to talk about RAD. The P&A does not justify the continued privatization of public housing through PACT or the Preservation Trust. In the P&A, NYCHA relies on the PACT program and Preservation Trust privatization in its plan to close the gap in its sorely needed funding. However, City Council must not allow NYCHA to use the P&A to justify the privatization of an essential public good at the expense of the rights and security of public housing tenants. We see the destabilizing effects of privatization. We see increased evictions, we see the demolition of homes, and we see all of this without access to any of the repairs that NYCHA residents have been promised. PACT is not a silver bullet. NYCHA induces its residents to vote in favor of these privatization schemes by making promises of improved conditions and access to repairs that even after conversion, these residents will likely never see. I will include just a couple of examples, but there are many more. A client of ours, Miss F., who was a NYCHA tenant for decades before RAD conversion, had been living with a broken fridge before conversion and for years after conversion. Additionally, when Miss F's granddaughter, who's been living with her for her whole life, alerted the new private management about mold and health concerns in the apartment, she was told by private management that she should sue her grandmother, Miss F., instead of the management company taking responsibility and doing the work required of them. Another client of ours, Miss J., after a long fight to finally receive a lease in her name for an apartment she had lived in for years, finally got a lease, and this was years after RAD conversion, and still Section 8 denied her application after inspecting the apartment because of the extensive repairs that needed to be done. These were repairs with issues with wiring, with mold concerns, and these were issues that our client, Miss J., had been asking about for years. Suffice to say, NYCHA uses the P&A to evade accountability and quite literally pass the buck to private companies, which mimic NYCHA and shirk their obligations to residents. The conditions in PACT buildings are so bad that they have forced international human rights organizations to take notice. In January 2022, Human Rights Watch published a damning report called "The Tenant Never Wins" about the terrible conditions in PACT developments. City Council must take action to stop NYCHA's misuse of the P&A. I will wrap up and say that we implore the City Council to mobilize and appropriate the money to fund NYCHA adequately, to invest in our public housing residents, and to provide the ongoing guidance, accountability, and oversight required to ensure that NYCHA does not evade its responsibilities, leaving public housing residents to suffer the consequences. We strongly urge this council to act now in collaboration with the state and federal governments to fully fund Section 9 and ensure that no public housing tenant in New York City has to compromise their rights to keep their home and to have a safe and habitable home. We also urge this council to provide oversight and guidance to ensure the P&A is not used to justify NYCHA's failure to meet its obligations to individual residents in need of repairs, or as an excuse for allowing apartments to lay vacant for years. Thank you for your attention to this urgent issue.
Thank you so much to this first panel, giving us clear insight into the daily experiences of residents and those who support them in managing through these unfortunate experiences. To the residents, thank you always for your fight and holding us to a much higher standard, unfortunately to a basic standard, which we seem not to be able to meet in this circumstance. I'd like to know, Ms. Keat, before we move to NYCHA, can you tell me what the engagement process has been from your perspective in Chelsea Elliott?
It's actually the Elliott Chelsea houses. One of the things I'm insisting on is it actually be called that. When we do that, is because the chair ended up, prior chair, Greg Russ, would always call it the Chelsea Elliott, centering the neighborhood and not the people. So Chelsea is not the she neighborhood everyone thinks it is. We know that. We live there. We've been there when the High Line was doing it, when it was actually the operational railroad. And I'm saying this because I want to remind people that we are the people who've been there all along. The gas stations, the post office that runs there, the taxi depots. We are an environmental justice area. Our trees mitigate that. We have at least 40 trees on one block. Very few people have that. That's what we do. The engagement, I would say it's not engagement. What NYCHA staff does, or anyone does, is actually have a sign-in sheet, and all they do is sign the name. I admit that. That is not engagement. That is just, we're saying these many people showed up, and that's what we did. The engagement process, when we found out about demolition, how should I begin this? There's nothing like finding out that your home is about to be destroyed from a newspaper and from the executive board of the community board. That was quite something to hear about. A packet, or should I say a one-pager, was put in our doorway and said we have a unique opportunity. Earlier that day, the New York Times ran an article. I found out about that 2 days later in a meeting with RPPH. That was highly unpleasant. Then I'm looking at the community board and hearing from the executive committee that they've already been down to City Hall. May I simply say that is not engagement. That is finding about destruction of your home and the discussion with everyone else. Then you are being told you are being engaged and this is resident driven. It is not a lie, it's a resident. The TA presidents are residents. There's thousands of other people you have to speak to as well. That has not been done. We've had meetings, yes. One was done on Saturday. Another was done on Monday. Of course, there was only one pager put up, and it was in English. As I said before, we are a diverse community. It can't just be in English. We have a great many Spanish speakers, Cantonese and Mandarin speakers, and Russian speakers. Engagement is minimal.
Thank you so much, Ms. Keat. It's clear that we need to have a significant public discussion on this entire issue. Thank you. I'd like to direct a question to Ms. Cohn. Ms. Cohn, can you tell me a little bit more specifically about what you're seeing in housing court as it relates to the P&A?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. So we provided just a couple of examples today, and the examples we see are similar, and I will give some specifics. So we have clients, I'll speak about one in particular, Miss S., who had brought NYCHA to housing court many times in HP actions seeking to have conditions fixed. There were large issues like broken elevators that so many NYCHA residents experience, to much easier, quicker fixes like replacing a toothbrush holder or replacing a bar in the sink so that she could safely bathe her son. When we ask for these repairs to be made, NYCHA reminds us that there's been a report, there's $78 billion worth of needs unmet, and that for that reason, our clients will have to wait for these very basic fixes that provide dignified homes. What we see is that because these defenses are presented to housing court judges on a regular basis, the housing court judges who are there to hold NYCHA accountable to its residents have started to believe that these repairs are impossible to be done and have said things like they don't want to make an order for NYCHA to make fixes because they don't want to make an order that they know will go undone. And so that's an example of what we see, all on the basis of, pointing to this P&A or this number that feels untenable, but does not mean that our clients and NYCHA residents do not deserve to live with dignity.
Thank you so much. It is truly concerning, and part of this situation, while there is obviously challenges and resources, it doesn't mean that we don't have the refrigerators, the microwaves, the ability to make the actual repair with a screw, because there are current resources in place to address these issues. There's a clear disconnect.
That is absolutely right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And a mythology that is really painful. I'd like to just switch quickly to Ms. Torres. As a TA president, as a CCOP member, longtime leader in NYCHA, you have seen the many P&As throughout the years. In particular to at least 2017, where all of the developments were surveyed. Have residents ever been engaged in the P&A process? Has CCOP been engaged in the P&A process beyond just reporting back to you all?
I will not talk about CCOP at that point because I just became a member last year, and so I really can't. But I can speak about Smith, and I can speak about the neighboring developments. No. We did have a manager, though. We were fortunate, we had a grievance committee, and unfortunately, my manager and my grievance committee chair have since passed, but locked heads, but that was the assessment we did at the ground level, not with the NYCHA hierarchy. And when we met with management, we were able to say these were our priorities. And the reason I did that was when I went to elected officials to ask them for capital monies, I needed to be clear about what I was asking for. And that's why I say that the needs assessment has to be done at the ground level with the residents so that you're clear. When we took NYCHA on the HPD class action suit, right? One of the reasons we won was because the grievance committee documented everything and we were able to show what needed to be fixed. And they fixed the apartments. However, everybody's clear. The issue is if you don't maintain, and that's what has happened in NYCHA, right? We have a saying in Spanish if the drop continues to fall on the rock, eventually the rock will burst, right? And if we don't maintain, and that's what has happened in NYCHA, there has been no maintenance. Things that are simple that can maybe cost $100, by the time it gets fixed, it's 1,000, and you multiply that. And so that's how you end up getting figures like this. But some of the fixes that they're so simple that it is beyond ridiculous, right? And they don't do it. It's always about a major thing. But once again, the needs assessment needs to be done on ground level with the resident association, and hopefully the resident association will have like a grievance committee, some kind of committee that they'll volunteer to knock with management so that we can get a true sense of what really needs to be fixed, right? And that has been the issue, that we're totally excluded from the process. And even though the regulations, the HUD regulations 964 says we're supposed to be included from conception, we're not. We're not. And because of that, these are the things that happen.
One last question. In terms of CCOP, and I appreciate you were not there then, but in terms of CCOP right now, has there been dialogue with NYCHA or an expectation that post P&A you will sit down and look at how these needs, how prioritization of addressing these needs will occur?
I don't want to answer that because there has been dialogue, but there's an issue that we're having with NYCHA about representation where 2/3 of Brooklyn and half of Queens are excluded from the meeting. And because of that, they have approached and they've done presentations, but I have personally, I'll speak for myself, I'm not going to speak for the other CCOP members, I have not been present on principle and about integrity.
Thank you, Ms. Torres. And thank you to the panel. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
We'll now move on to the panel from NYCHA, if you all want to come up and we'll swear you in. So if you all could just raise your hand, I'll administer the oath, and then I'd ask that you all state your name and title for the record. Do you affirm to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth in your testimony before this committee, and to respond honestly to council member questions?
I do.
I do.
I do.
And then if you would like to, just state your name and your title, and then I believe we have the PowerPoint set up, so just you can tell the person on the Zoom to move forward as it goes.
Sure. Sean Mavani, Chief Asset and Capital Management Officer at NYCHA.
Matthew Charney, Vice President of Design and Construction for the Real Estate Development Department.
Brian Honan, Senior Vice President, NYCHA Intergovernmental.
Actually, before you jump into your presentation, I just want to acknowledge we've been joined by Council Member Mealy and Council Member Sanchez. Thank you.
Thank you. Chair Alexa Aviles, members of the Committee on Public Housing, other distinguished members of the City Council, NYCHA residents, community advocates, and members of the public, good morning. I'm Sean Mavani, NYCHA's Chief Asset and Capital Management Officer. I'm pleased to be joined by Vice President of Design and Construction for Real Estate Development, Matthew Charney, sitting on my left, and Senior Vice President of Intergovernmental Affairs, Brian Honan. Thank you again for this opportunity to discuss the significant capital needs across NYCHA's portfolio and the ways we're addressing them to bring residents the quality of life they deserve. Our number one priority is to ensure the health and safety of our properties for today's residents and the generations to come. And there are a number of critical housing preservation initiatives underway to comprehensively rehabilitate NYCHA's developments and better support the communities we serve. NYCHA's 2023 Physical Needs Assessment, or P&A, estimates the 20-year physical needs at $78.3 billion across 264 public housing properties that NYCHA currently directly manages, comprising 161,400 apartments. This represents a 73% increase from the 2017 P&A's total estimated needs of $45.3 billion. The P&A is a critical resource for effectively evaluating capital investment needs, as well as for planning and prioritizing capital investments across our properties. Conducted approximately every 5 years, as recommended by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, the P&A involves assessing when in the next 20 years the physical assets that make up NYCHA's buildings and campuses will require replacement or upgrade, and then estimating the cost for these renovations based on current market prices and NYCHA's recent contracts. NYCHA has undertaken P&A since 2006. A 20-year capital investment outlook is recommended by HUD, as it is a real estate industry standard and it captures the magnitude of capital investment required to comprehensively address the conditions of NYCHA's aging buildings and campuses to bring them to a good state of repair and ensure their long-term viability. Going forward, NYCHA will update the 2023 P&A results on an annual basis. This will ensure that estimates can reflect both increases in needs due to market price escalation or other causes, as well as needs that have been addressed through completed capital projects and other programs. NYCHA's 2017 P&A included architectural and engineering assessments at all buildings and grounds for more than 300 NYCHA properties, and it generated over 40,000 data points and hundreds of reports. Many physical assets and building systems were found to be close to, at, or beyond their useful life at that time. Because the 2017 P&A collected so much baseline information for assessing asset conditions and modeling future deterioration, NYCHA focused the 2023 P&A on inspections at a representative sample of 30 properties with approximately 29,000 apartments. The purpose of these on-site inspections was to verify and update the asset deterioration forecast applied to all properties, as is common practice in the industry. This was done through surveys and interviews of property staff and resident leaders at these sites, joint walkthroughs, and architectural and engineering assessments in all buildings, 10 to 15% of apartments in each property, and the grounds. While physical needs assessments typically focus on visual inspection of physical assets, one apartment wall was opened for a sample of apartments and buildings at the different properties to also allow assessment of conditions of piping and other elements behind the walls. Data from various recent analyses, work order data, environmental testing results, and field assessments undertaken by NYCHA were also used in the 2023 P&A to further validate the inspection results and to incorporate new areas of scope not included in 2017, such as lead-based paint abatement, decarbonization of heating systems, and open spaces enhancements. Approximately 2/3 of the 73% increase from 2017 to the 2023 P&A is driven by market price escalation, and the remaining 1/3 by the additional scope areas I mentioned, accelerated asset deterioration, and methodology refinements. I'd like to note that the 2023 P&A figure excludes approximately $10.5 billion of needs addressed since 2017 through completed capital projects and the PAC program. Just moving to the presentation, if we can move to slide 2, which shows some of the numbers that I've just quoted around the change between the 2017 and the 2023 P&A. And we can also move to slide 3, please. It's important to note that 54%, or $42.1 billion, of the total need identified relates to assets already at the end of their useful life and requiring replacement immediately or within the next year, and 77%, or $60.3 billion, of the total need identified relates to assets requiring replacement within the next 5 years. Thus, while the P&A is a 20-year physical needs estimate, the majority of these needs require capital investment in the very short term. Next slide, please. NYCHA's capital investments are currently focused on major building systems in line with the requirements of the HUD agreement, including heating systems, elevators, waste management infrastructure, building exteriors to reduce mold, and lead-based paint abatement, as well as safety and security-related systems. Apartments, therefore, comprise the largest share of the physical needs, as shown on the slide, followed by additional investments required in heating systems, building exteriors, and plumbing in particular. These areas together account for $57.8 billion, or 74% of the total physical needs across our properties. The remaining 26% comprises a range of building systems and components, as well as grounds improvements. Next slide, please. The per apartment average physical need, including all assets within the buildings and campuses, is approximately $485,000. Of course, the level of physical need can vary significantly across our properties. Buildings comprising 61% of NYCHA apartments have less than an average $500,000 in per apartment physical need, while 39% require more than $500,000 of investment. In addition, the actual cost of any individual project to address specific assets at each property can vary significantly from these figures due to factors such as the project's particular scope of work and procurement approach. To tackle these enormous needs, we're executing a large capital projects portfolio, as well as pursuing a variety of innovative and vital housing preservation initiatives. Next slide, please. We must use every tool and strategy available to improve residents' quality of life through desperately needed investment. As shown on this slide, we believe that approximately $38 billion, or 49% of the 20-year P&A estimate, can be addressed through ongoing and planned capital projects, the PACT program, and the Public Housing Preservation Trust. There are currently more than 750 ongoing and planned capital projects focused on almost $5 billion of investment in individual building systems and components or comprehensive modernization of properties. In collaboration with our partners, we aim to fully rehabilitate an additional 47,000 apartments through PACT, and the Public Housing Preservation Trust law currently allows for the comprehensive renovation of 25,000 apartments. The majority of NYCHA's properties are more than half a century old, and they've not received the regular investment that all buildings require to remain in a state of good repair. Our mission is to bring our developments the massive investment needed through all avenues possible to support the health, safety, and quality of life of NYCHA families. Funding is required from all levels of government, in particular the state and federal government, to help address these needs. Thank you for your partnership as we ensure that NYCHA remains a vital bastion of affordable housing for the decades to come. Thank you again, and we're happy to answer any questions you may have today.
Thank you so much for your testimony. I'll open with a few questions, and we'll turn it over to my colleagues because I know they have to run, but you get to sit with me as long as it takes. So I'll take privilege in that. I guess just to jump into some of the particulars, can you identify how much of a percentage increase you've seen in construction costs?
Sure. The P&A, and thank you again for the question, the P&A exercise identified a significant increase in construction costs that accounted for almost 2/3 of the total increase from 2017 to 2023. That's a result of both general inflation, and in particular the high levels of inflation we've seen after COVID, but also impacts on supply chains globally and in the US, and construction indice prices. So the construction industry indices that we track had historic increases in 2021 and 2022, which has kind of raised the baseline level of construction work in the city and I think across the country.
Thank you. In 2017, some of the biggest costs were attributable to architectural needs at about $11 billion, windows, roofs, and mechanical about $3 billion. How have the physical needs in these particular categories changed in the past 5 years?
So some of those architectural aspects like windows, roofs, and facades are critical for the investments that we're making under the HUD agreement, in particular around mold remediation. The majority of our investments in the 2017 to 2023 period have been around roofing out of those types of assets, in particular because of the city-funded mayoral roofing program that we've been implementing for several years now. We have not been able to invest a significant amount in windows, which you highlighted, and that continues to be a major part of the need, and one of the reasons why the building exteriors component that was highlighted on one of the slides is one of the biggest categories of needs that we have. Facades of buildings, exteriors, also continue to be a major area of need, as was highlighted. We are increasingly making more investments in facades as we've been able to mobilize more funding around that. And then the architectural needs that are within apartments, which I think you also noted, is a key area where we have not been able to make the type of investments we'd like to, simply because we've been so focused on health and safety through building systems investments. and also compliance requirements. Going forward, through our different programs and tools, we hope to very much increase the amount of investment we can make in the actual apartment architectural features.
Okay. In terms of the P&A, physical needs assessment, is obviously intended to be a comprehensive inventory of NYCHA's capital needs. Do you believe that the 2023 P&A is an accurate reflection of NYCHA's physical plan?
Yes, I think the P&A is an accurate reflection of our overall needs. Chair, as you highlighted earlier, the critical needs in the next 5 years as well as the longer-term needs. I think it is important to keep in mind that the P&A is fundamentally a planning and capital strategy development tool. It does inform the specific planning of individual projects, budgeting, and all of that, but it is not a replacement for cost estimating and other activities we undertake when we actually have a project and a budget. And so it is extremely important in our process to allow us to have a consistent yardstick to look across properties to understand where systems are failing, where investments are most critical, and then to be able to make those one-off system investments as we do through most of our capital portfolio. And it's very informative for that process.
Thank you. So, I mean, that's an area that is really, really difficult to see on the ground, where the P&A, how the P&A actually influences the capital strategy, and how the P&A, can you tell us more specifically how you see that? Because it's very hard to see that in practice. I'd like to know how you see the P&A informing the capital planning specifically, and then how you see the P&A informing NYCHA's actual operations.
Thank you for the question. A very critical question, I think, for all of our stakeholders to understand. And I'll give you an example maybe to start, starting with the HUD agreement that we signed in 2019, right? The HUD agreement clarified that NYCHA should be prioritizing 5 areas with our capital investments as well as our operational improvements. So for example, heating systems and elevators were 2 of the areas, mold, lead-based paint, and waste management. The P&A was utilized at the time to identify which specific sites that we need to prioritize, for example, boiler replacements or heating system improvements, right? The P&A, along with more high-frequency work order data, operational data, tenant input, is used to then determine if we're going to invest a large amount of funding across our heating systems throughout the city, what specific developments are most in need of those replacements, right? Because the P&A captures the assets at the site, how old they are, how they're operating, how many more years they can operate effectively. It's a key input to determine which specific assets we need to prioritize with the funding we have in a specific area. So we use that back at that point to prioritize each of those major capital pipelines, and together the investments that we're making due to the HUD agreement comprises about 90% of our capital portfolio, and we're currently in the middle of many of those investments. As we are able to mobilize additional funding or receive additional, federal, state, or city grants, we always go back to that same approach of utilizing the most recent P&A data along with the most recent operational data, and where we have that resident input to then prioritize what specific assets we allocate that funding against.
Okay, we're gonna get back to this, because I think it's still very hard to understand how the needs are actually getting addressed, right? And obviously, when we see the physical need across the developments feeling like underwater, it feels like nothing is ever getting addressed, and yet we have millions of dollars, potentially billions, circulating through a system. So I think I'm going to pause on this, and I'd like to bring my colleagues into the conversation, and we will get back to this more specifically. Okay, and so first we'd like to have Councilmember Osei.
Thank you, Chair Vilas, and good morning. I have a bit of questions, but the first one I wanted to start with was, does NYCHA know the need status for RAD/PACT developments? Is there a similar evaluation and inspection being done to all of our developments?
So let me ask my colleague Matt to take that question.
Sure. Are you asking for about developments that have already converted through RAD/PACT?
Yes.
Yeah. So we, I guess it's, I'll take the opportunity, if you don't mind, to describe how we use the P&A, and
Sure.
we do other. Okay. So for RAD/PACT, the P&A is really a starting point. It's the best available information. HUD requires all RAD projects to do what is called a CNA, or RAD CNA. It's kind of a similar exercise to the P&A, a capital needs assessment. So we do that with a third-party vendor. We get into, we meet with residents before that, interview them, interview property management. The inspectors go into 25% of the units, all of the vacant units, all the other, investigate building systems, and the ancillary residential spaces. And so that is then used and developed through pre-development and ultimately results in the scope of work for the RAD project. It's a requirement by HUD to meet the 20-year needs of the development. So that doesn't always mean that everything's done up front. Sometimes, like, just to give an example, like a roof NYCHA will have replaced within the past 5 years. We're not going to replace that roof through the RAD/PACT scope because there's still useful life on it. But HUD requires that we put funds aside through a capital reserve to make sure we're addressing that, in 15 years or whenever the roof is up. So we do think that these properties are in good shape, both with the immediate repair needs that happen immediately after conversion, but also through the capital reserves that are put into the financing to address any future unmet needs. There's also, annual repair, maintenance, operation budgets. We also, require a 20-year needs assessment every 20 years for RAD/PACT projects, or, whenever our partner HDC requests it, they do annual inspections. We oversee the project through construction. We are collecting work order data ongoing, so if there's any spikes in heating requests, we'll be able to see that on a monthly basis, so we'll know that there's a problem. So we do have, ongoing reporting on work orders, and there's a long-term plan for capital repairs and maintenance.
Thank you. And I want to follow up with a very basic question that I think all of us in this room and anyone listening, and especially my constituents, would want to hear. But, we have these hearings multiple times a year, especially when it comes to repairing the facilities and the homes in which many of our constituents live in. And a lot of the repairs that are being done are patchwork, right? They're not the real work that is needed for the infrastructure to be damaged once again. What is the total cost that it would take for us to not have to have these hearings and, excuse my language, but bitch back and forth to the agency about the work that's needed to be done to repair NYCHA as a whole? I'm just wondering what the overall cost would be.
So Councilmember Osei, thank you for raising that question. To some degree, the P&A is that number, right? Okay.
And that number is?
And in particular, I would say what the chair highlighted earlier, the critical needs component, the $60 billion investment that's required in the next 5 years would mean that we would have fully renovated properties in that state. Obviously, 5 years from now or 10 years from now, additional investments will always be required, but that's kind of, I think, the best answer to your question.
Thank you. And do you want to speak to that as well?
If I could just chime in too. So the P&A and the capital work that Sean's talking about is just one part of it, right? Sure. And it's a very important part of it, and it's the infrastructure. Yeah. But then we also have two budgets, right? We have an operating budget as well. And the operating budget, that is the budget that takes care of staff, that takes care of the day-to-day repairs. And if both of them aren't going up at the same time, even if Sean somehow got a check tomorrow, when he comes back to the office and there's a check waiting for him for $78 billion, and he's able to do that work quickly, we need to make sure that we're keeping up in the operations side so we're able to maintain that. When I first started at NYCHA, we had 16,000 employees. We're down to about 12,000. Okay. And so when you take a hit like that, and when I go to developments and I speak to staff, which is often, Staff don't tell me, like, I wish I had more vacation, I wish I had, a raise. I'm sure they would love that. But what they say is, if you guys just give me 2 or 3 more people, I think we can
I
kill
hear
it.
you. And what's the price tag for that? Do you have an idea of what the?
We can come back with the council on that, but
That should be a number that we have, right? I'm just saying this because, and I know that I sound a bit agitated, and I am, and it's not at you folk, and I really appreciate people who work for the city, especially when so many people are not applying to these jobs, nor are you being paid enough. President Joe Biden, and our federal government passed the Infrastructure and Jobs Act this year, right? That's over $1 trillion that's supposed to go towards infrastructure and jobs, right? About $200 billion is supposed to go to New York State, and I want NYCHA, I want our city agencies, I want our state government to be moving with urgency on bringing that money down, right? Say it's $78 billion for the infrastructural repair that is needed. There is money from the federal government that our city government should be pulling down to make sure that that price tag isn't solely on the budget of the city. And I'm wondering what your plan is, whether it's in communication with HUD to bring that money down, to communicate with our state partners, and making sure that that money that was passed this year, our taxpayer dollars, are going directly towards this decades-long wait to repair public housing in New York City. So what is the strategy on bringing that money down?
Sure. Thank you so much, Councilman. So, well, number one, in the original infrastructure bill, the Build Back Better bill, we spent a lot of time both working with HUD, with congressional leaders. Unfortunately, that did not happen. However, the infrastructure bill that did pass, there is a significant amount of funding in there through IRA and through other programs like that, which we are a part of the conversations. We have several, and we can give the council all of our applications. We've given it to congressional leaders to help us, back us in that. A lot of it is related to sustainability, which is really important because if we are going to invest,
Absolutely.
we need to do it in a green way.
100%.
And we just recently announced that Woodside Houses, which is development that, over the last few winters has had significant issues, is going to have a green system, is going to have, a clean heating system. So we are taking advantage, if there's money available, we're going to take advantage of it. Whether it's through, security funding, whether it's through green infrastructure, but we're taking advantage of, what's out there.
And how much money have you secured from the IJA?
We so far have not secured it, but we have applications in, and we can give the council all of our applications and the dollar amount.
And that would be great. Listen, I would love for the council to be supportive of advocating for that funding, right? We are here to also be a partner with city agencies on bringing that money down. I just think we need to be moving with urgency because there's going to be multiple, folks within the state that want that money. But this is a pressing issue, right? I'm sure you don't like to come here multiple times a year and have us, hammer in on these issues. I'm sure the people that live in NYCHA are so uncomfortable with how there's been a lack of urgency on repairs, on real repairs within their living conditions. So this is an opportunity for us to really work together on making sure that that money that was passed through the federal government is truly invested within our NYCHA developments. Can I ask one local, sorry, I'm so sorry, but my staff was at Albany Houses yesterday, and our TA president, Carolyn Johnson, raised some repair issues. At 1414 Bergen and 1430 Bergen, there are lights that do not work, which makes it dangerous for the residents. So if we could get immediate inspections there and repairs, that would be wonderful. And there's also a fence missing at the park between 1008 St. Mark's and 1191 Park Place. So if we could look into that, that would be wonderful. And if you can follow up with my office, you know where to find me. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councilman. By the end of the day, we'll get you an update, and then we'll follow through by the end of early next week.
Thank you.
Thank you, Council Member. And we can't underscore enough this notion of partnership, and certainly NYCHA has reached out to our office in support of a federal application around sustainability issues. But we haven't received any other communication about other applications. And so where you can leverage our urgency, because we are talking to the residents every day, we want to be a part of that. We don't want to have to wait for a hearing to ask about those applications because there is additional federal resources we absolutely must draw down on. So I can't underscore that enough. a partner in action, not after the fact. So with that, I just wanted to ask one quick question, then I'll turn it over to a follow-up on Councilmember Osei's questions around RAD impact, particularly around the CNA. Hold on here. So in terms of the capital needs assessment, excuse me. Thank you for your patience. In terms of the CNA process, can you tell us, are the capital needs assessments that are developed by the developers provided to the residents during the conversion process?
Thanks for the question. First, the CNAs are developed primarily by a third party, not the development team that NYCHA hires directly. We meet with the residents, and sometimes they even tag along on those inspections, although it's a lot. 25% of units at some of these developments is a lot.
Can you speak up, please?
Sorry, yeah. No, typically we don't provide the CNAs in full to the residents. We usually provide a summary. But we're happy to when it's requested, and if it's requested, they're just pretty dense documents, so we try to summarize it for residents.
So this third-party vendor, just to understand this process, so NYCHA hires a third-party vendor who does a capital needs assessment for a private developer?
We do a capital needs assessment on the properties that are planned to go packed, yeah.
So why are we subsidizing work for developers?
We're doing that to get an idea of what the needs of the packed project are, of what needs to happen in the repairs. It's a required part of the HUD's program, HUD's RAD program.
Maybe I can help here, Chair Aviles.
Yeah.
So the developer does their own deep dive assessment, which takes 6 to 9 months. They do a whole battery of on-site inspections, testing, and design work, and they come up with their own view on the scope and the needs. And multiple developers, in the past, can do that type of analysis and propose different things for a property. What Matt is referring to is we have to do our own due diligence as a second layer of quality control. The reason that we employ technical consultants on our side as NYCHA is to ensure that we are fully aligned with whatever work is coming out of the developer, and that is one of the requirements, so that when that goes to HUD for approval, we're able to demonstrate our own due diligence of that work as well.
Thank you. Coming in for the save, I was about to lose my mind. So what you're speaking of is a second layer of quality control from an initial developer-funded assessment that they do on their own.
That's right. We always have to have our own independent view on whatever it is that they're proposing.
Got it. And in terms of either of these assessments, I guess we heard the second layer of quality control. We provide summaries. Is the deep dive initial assessment done by the developer provided to the residents? Is there a way for them to access the assessments on their properties?
So I'll start, and Matt, you can add. Because they're doing a pretty broad range of assessments, which typically goes, for example, much deeper than the P&A, including probing, piping, and behind walls and all that. There's a whole range of inspections and testing they do. They are also typically summarizing that and bringing that to the resident conversations around the priority scope, where different funding will be utilized, and all of that. So we don't have a requirement that they have to share all of these very detailed inspections report with residents, but it's part of the discussion as residents are trying to prioritize what they think are the most important needs to be addressed through the conversion process.
Got it. I'd imagine it's probably a small universe of companies that are expert in these areas. Is there, I'm thinking third-party reviewers, vendors, and developers are probably all good friends. What are the safeguards to make sure that we do receive like truly independent third party in such a small space?
Well, I think that It's a very good question. Thank you for asking. The universe of these type of consultants I don't think is so small. So basically, any architectural engineering firm is able to provide this type of assessment independently of another firm. So on our capital portfolio, for example, we work with over 50 architectural engineering firms of different sizes. We have cost estimating firms. And then the real estate development community has a much broader capability around that as well. So I think it's definitely a good thing that we look out for around any potential conflict of interest, given the variety of work that we do. But we do have a battery of providers who can do these things. We also have specific controls in place that if a firm is involved in a project in one way, they can't be involved in the project any other way, right? And so those are all in our contractual requirements.
Thank you for finding the words that I could not find, conflict of interest and controls and firewalls between them. Thank you for that. Just lastly, in terms of in terms of the CNA, Elliott Chelsea has had a CNA done as part of their early potential process?
No, not a rad CNA.
Okay, so the only assessment Elliott Chelsea has had is the PNA component of 2017?
2017, 2023, it was part of the 2023 PNA.
Right.
And,
But was it one of the sites that was looked at specifically? Because we know the 2023 PNA only looked at a sample, 30% or 20% of the actual development.
No, Fulton, Elliott, Chelsea, those sites were not one of the 30.
Could you please turn your
Mike.
mic?
Sorry. No, Fulton, Elliott, Chelsea, and Chelsea Addition were not some of the 30 sites that we did the field inspections. However, we did have a lot of data from the 2017 PNA. So while a formal CNA has not been completed, right, the development team that was designated there last year has been doing extensive investigations and testing on site, which is, I think, obviously one of the drivers of what led resident leadership of those sites to want to move in a different direction. The findings from those assessments, the kind of cost estimates to make repairs, I would say that independently, while the designated firms were doing their analysis, we were doing the 2023 PNA, and the numbers have landed in a similar place at just over $1 billion for a full comprehensive renovation.
All right, we're gonna get back to some of these pieces, but I will turn it over to Councilmember Brewer. Thank you.
Thank you. First of all, thank you, Brian Honan. I just want to make that on the record. When you have federal money, I should know this because I did it many years ago, do you need a match or is it just application and you get it or you don't?
It depends very much, Councilmember Brewer, on the type of funding. So our core kind of HUD allocations and other funding we may receive for example, after disaster recovery from the federal government may not require a match, but there are a range of programs now, especially with some of these new acts that have come out that can require like a local match.
Okay, so the ones that you're applying for, some do and some don't. If they do require, do you have a match? Sometimes you do have it.
Yes, sometimes we do from an existing city allocation, or sometimes we request it through the process with the city to satisfy that local match requirement.
Okay, just because I always look for every penny, so I guess you could let us know. It would be helpful for the committee to know we're applying, we have the match, we're applying, we don't have the match. That would be helpful for us to know. My real issue, and maybe this is in the PNA, which I must admit I have not read. I'm embarrassed to say, but I have looked at your summary. I am focused on, I want to know how many, 6,900, 6,200, how many vacant apartments exist. I know at Amsterdam houses there are 40 exactly. And then what's the cost to renovate them? And can you renovate them? I don't know this is across the board, but can you renovate some, most, without doing a complete, I understand if the roof is leaking, why do we renovate the apartment under the roof? Because you're gonna have mold. But is there some or has it been looked at? I know that your CEO has been talking about this. Is there some way of addressing some of the vacant apartments for the obvious reasons we need affordable housing without the understandable 78, 60 billion, et cetera? You get the point. Is there something we can do for however many? How much does it cost? Are you thinking about that?
So let me clarify and try to answer some parts of your question, and then I think I'll call up Andrew Kaplan, our Chief of Staff at NYCHA, to get into some more of the details that you asked for. I want to be clear that turning over apartments for new tenants to come in once they're vacant is not dependent on fully meeting all of the capital repairs.
No, I understand that, but it's not happening, so that's what I'm trying to figure out.
So we have a very expansive turnover program in our operations function where we typically, the two things we focus on is bringing all elements of the apartment to a reasonable state of repair without large capital investment. So, redoing kitchen cabinetry, doing painting, things like that. And we also make sure that we fully abate the apartment if it has any type of lead and asbestos in it. And that's what our turnover program comprises and is not dependent on these capital investments that we may be making.
Okay, so it could be regarding the P&A or not, depending.
Yes, we have a large team working extremely actively on turnovers, at any given time. And maybe Andrew can provide a little bit more detail here.
It's just my experience that it's not happening. That's what I wanted to know. Go ahead.
Just before if you could raise your right hand. Do you affirm to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth in your testimony before this committee and to respond honestly to council member questions?
I do. So thank you, Councilmember, and we can certainly follow up with more information about this, including the exact number, because I don't think any of us have it offhand. It does depend on the specific instance, so some apartments are different than others. Some require a lot of work. We have a very extensive length of time that many residents are in apartments for, and so sometimes that does require a lot of work, which I know you're aware of, and sometimes it's very light touch. But like Sean was mentioning, one of the things that we've been putting in place over the last few years is a quite extensive process of dealing with environmental hazards, where we are testing, making sure that we understand the level of lead, the level of asbestos that's in these apartments, and if there's any work required there, making sure that we're doing that appropriately. And one of the changes that I'll just note there is that when the lead base paint level dropped from 1 to 0.5, that added an extra layer of work on these apartments as well. But we know this is a very challenging issue and something that the authorities really focused on.
Focused and doing. So the P&A has nothing to do with it. In other words, there's nothing in the P&A that has anything to do because it's not the same kind of capital need. Is that correct?
So I guess, and Sean can certainly speak more to the capital side of this. The physical needs assessment does cover apartment work, and it does cover lead-based paint abatement. So many of the things that we are doing on an operational side in vacant units, that is covered in the P&A. But a lot of the work that we're doing, the vast majority of what we're doing in terms of day-to-day work, is some of what Brian was mentioning earlier, that operational side where our staff or vendors are doing the work.
I don't want to take too much time. I guess I would the committee, if it's appropriate, to know how many, because we did give city council money for this also. There's capital money from the council for this effort. I'd like to know how many are being done, how much it costs, how many there are, where they are, et cetera, because there's nothing worse than telling the public and New Yorkers, I think the number's either 6,200 or 6,900 vacant apartments at NYCHA. And so the question is, what are we doing about it? And how it could fit into the P&A. It seems to me, if I was the federal government, it would be nice to see capital needs going towards that effort.
Yes, so Councilmember, we can certainly follow up with all of those details.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
We want to acknowledge we've been joined by Councilmember Salamanca and turn it over to Councilmember Ressler.
Great. Thank you so much. I firstly just want to thank Chair Aviles for focusing on this. The extraordinary increase in the physical needs assessment absolutely requires our attention and oversight, and I'm really pleased that we're having this hearing today. We beat up NYCHA a lot, so I'll start by just saying something nice. That Andrew, you are a tremendous public servant, and I appreciate everything you do. And Brian as well. You guys always respond. You always try. I know that your jobs are hard, and that we have under-resourced. We, city, state, federal, have under-resourced NYCHA for many, many decades. and we see the deterioration in this physical needs assessment. I was struck by the $78 billion number. So last time around it was $45 billion. $10 billion was addressed through RAD and PAC conversions and capital projects. So really we're saying there was a $43 billion increase in the physical needs assessment for a much substantially smaller portfolio of NYCHA units, correct? So in this, yeah, sorry, you can tell me you agree with me?
That's right. I mean, the number of units has gone down, I think, by about 13,000 between those two numbers.
So we essentially saw a doubling of the physical needs assessment for a smaller number of units.
I think, yes, if you take into account the unit reduction, it's a doubling, and that is relatively consistent with our last 3 PNAs and how things have changed over time.
And so it was 485,000, I believe, per apartment in this PNA. What was it for the previous PNA? The most recent?
I believe it was in the range of 240,000, around there.
Startling and dramatic increase in a short period of time. Of course, you're attributing part of that to inflation, but our failure to invest and maintain in these units is we're watching them crumble before our very eyes. And this physical needs assessment shows it as crisply as possible. You know, in our community in Wyckoff and Gowanus, where we're doing a $250 million comprehensive modernization project, we're addressing 25%, 30% of the need in those developments. So as exciting as that is, we have people who have horrible conditions for years on end that won't be addressed at all through this process. I did have one question that I wanted clarification on. In the physical needs assessment in Appendix F, you do a breakdown of every development, including the RAD and PAC developments. We have 4 such developments in our district, but you list out a physical needs assessment estimate for those 4, for each development, including the RAD and PAC developments. For those 4 developments, it amounts to $600 million, real money. So could you explain that? Or do those developments continue to have a substantial outstanding need that you're just taking off of your books because it's the RAD and PAC developers' responsibility?
Thank you, Councilmember Essler. Maybe just to address your question, we did include sites that had been converted between 2017 and 2023 to be able to understand exactly how much capital need they've addressed from our perspective that would have been there if the conversion hadn't happened. And that's why—
Are you arguing that they've addressed those capital needs, or that those are outstanding capital needs, or a combination?
Yeah, so on that second part, I'll go back to what Matt explained, which is at the time of conversion, they're required to address all critical needs, typically whatever's required investment in the next 5 years, and they're required to demonstrate a plan with their capital reserve to make any ongoing investments required in the next 20 years, okay? And so that is typically what happens in the kind of 18 months to 3-year construction process after a PAC conversion. They invest in and address all of those critical needs. And they start to hold a capital reserve that would allow them to make kind of year 5, year 10, 15 investments for remaining needs.
So they are on the hook, essentially, to make those full investments over the period of time?
That's right. That is the plan that HUD approves with the conversion. Yeah.
And what is the mechanism for us to be updated on the actual investments that are being made to be able to assure tenants in our developments that these investments are happening?
Yeah. So within NYCHA, we are receiving quarterly financial reports that include any additional investments they're making, as well as operating investments they're making around maintenance and repairs.
Could those reports be shared with me for our developments?
So I think that we can look into that with you and understand what will be most useful information for you to have.
Okay. I mean, I just want to make sure that we're holding these developers accountable to make the investments that they're required to make to actually fulfill the outstanding $600 million in investments that are needed to improve the conditions for residents in those developments. And could I go just one, or are you rushing?
Actually, would like to know, in terms of the quarterly financial reports, are those, are they verified? Are you doing control checks to make sure that what is reported is in fact what is happening in
So
the
similar
developments?
so we have within our real estate development group who manages these PAC projects, we have an asset management function, which we've discussed in previous hearings with you, that looks at the performance of the PAC developer across multiple areas, and one of those areas is the financial performance and reporting. So we are getting that information from them. We're also getting other forms of information from their Section 8 reporting that they do independently and watching what's happening on that side. So we do diligence around those financial reports and monitor them and work with them when we see problems or issues that we may feel are concerning to make. I just wanted to add one additional point on CM Ressler's question around the funding. I mean, Matt highlighted, and I reiterated that PAC partners are required to have an investment plan to meet those 20-year needs. The one thing to keep in mind is that the P&A is very useful for NYCHA, where we're doing individual systems and asset replacements in terms of pricing how much each of those may cost. Our PAC partners, or as you mentioned, our Comp Mod program that does these large integrated scope projects, often is able to achieve efficiencies and economies, which means they may not have to invest the full $600 million because they're able to do all of these different assets at the same time.
Yeah.
And so that's something to keep in mind.
I have a few more questions, but do you want me to come back later?
Mr. Mavani, if you would, I think I lost in your response. Are you verifying what the reports that you're receiving? It definitely sounds like the asset management group is reviewing these reports, reviewing the other reporting that is being submitted to HUD. What I was asking is more basic, like, are we verifying that those repairs that are being claimed in those reports actually happening on the ground?
Yes, so on the repair side of it, in addition to receiving data and analyzing that data and looking for trends or issues, we are making site visits. Matt can talk about the site inspections and work that we do during construction, and then we continue to do the site validation of what we're hearing from PAC partners even after construction, if you want to talk about that.
And I just want to, I gave the example of, like a roof that we had just replaced would be, not done immediately, but the majority of this work is in the immediate capital repairs. The goal is to do all the work that's needed up front. So, Councilmember Ressler, for the developments in your district, which were part of what was known as the Brooklyn Bundle. So it included other developments that I think are not in your district, but it was
Councilmember Ressler.
For $430 million of work. Almost nearly $500 million of work. That's all up front. That's all within that 2 months after, and we're tracking that on a monthly basis. Requisitions, we're doing site inspections. We have a goal of getting into 10% of all the units after they're done. We're actually around 20-30%. So, we're really tracking that. That's our primary. There is work that will be done over time, but our goal is that work is very minimal. But as Sean described, we are getting regular reports, and we do site visits, resident surveys long after the repairs are done, and we plan to do that, kind of in perpetuity.
Thank you. Is that okay? I'll just try to be brief. So firstly, when you recently came to this committee, NYCHA informed us that there were smaller capital projects that you could no longer perform or were delayed indefinitely because you didn't have enough staff to be able to execute on these capital projects. Is the lack of staffing undermining NYCHA's ability to execute on its current capital plan to be able to meet capital needs across the portfolio of NYCHA housing?
Sure, and thank you for the question. I don't believe that our operating budget and obviously our staffing is undermining our plan. I think for a few reasons. We've grown significantly in the last 5 years, whereas we used to implement less than 200 capital projects at any given time. Even with the 45 or so projects that we paused this year, we're currently implementing close to 700. So we've scaled, more than 3 times in this period, and we're able to manage a portfolio that's much larger than we used to. We have not paused any critical kind of HUD agreement investments, health and safety, security-related investments. We continue to take on new projects that relate to those HUD commitments, like heating, elevators, and other areas that we're required to take on. And we have not had to, delay those projects because of operating budget or staffing needs. Unfortunately, we have had to delay the 40 to 50, also critical quality of life type of projects, and we continue to have those paused. But we do hope that with the projects that we're completing every month, at some point next year, we'll be able to restart some of those projects with a phased plan.
Okay. It's something we're going to certainly be monitoring closely here in the council, and especially with the mayor's proposed draconian budget cuts that would severely undermine services across the board. Reducing staffing at NYCHA, it would be highly detrimental. And then lastly, if I may, vacancies. I appreciate Councilmember Brewer mentioning this. I don't think I heard a clear number on the number of vacancies. I know there are different categories of vacancies, but not the total unoccupied, but the vacant apartments that are potentially habitable and with some amount of work. Where are we on those numbers now? They've been skyrocketing under the Adams administration. It's an area of grave concern in a housing crisis.
Right, so thank you, Councilmember. And what I was saying to Councilmember Brewer is that I don't think any of us have the exact number, but we can follow up with that after this hearing immediately.
Okay. I mean, we've seen, I don't know, 8-fold increase under this mayor in the number of vacant apartments. And we, thanks to Chair Aviles' leadership, pushed for $30-odd million in restoration of funding for repairs of vacant units. But if we need to be we believe more money needs to be pushed to address this, and we will continue to advocate for it. Just in closing, we all have to push Washington together. Congressmember Velasquez and Senator Schumer have been exceptional leaders in fighting for more funding for public housing. I know Leader Jeffries cares about this a great deal as well. What Joe Manchin did on Build Back Better was unconscionable, and we should have had a historic investment in public housing in that plan. It needs to be in the next big thing that comes out of Congress whenever we retake the House, and anything we can do to help support that effort, please count us in. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Ressler. And just for a point of clarification, Mr. Movani, did you just say that the projects, the council discretionary projects that were placed on hold because of lack of project management staff will be coming online in a staggered way?
Yes, Chair. So once we have capacity in our teams to start those projects up again, we'll be developing out a kind of phased plan to do that. There's obviously a range of considerations around how we sequence that, and we'd be happy to have that discussion with any council member around projects that they've funded.
So you currently do not have the capacity for those projects, is that correct?
That's right. We have not restarted any of those projects as of today.
Do you have an understanding of a secret stash of money that's coming in that will bring these projects online anytime soon?
No, it's not because of additional funding. It's because other projects that we're currently managing will complete and close off, and that will free up our teams to then have capacity to increase the number of projects they're managing, right? So every year we complete, for reference, between 120 and 140 projects. And so, throughout the year as projects are completing, and we are also starting other new HUD agreement projects, we will also be trying to restart these projects.
Got it. We'll talk more about that, but I'd like to recognize Deputy Speaker Ayala and also turn it over to Councilmember Salamanca.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's frustrating to hear that funding that the council allocates to NYCHA is just sitting there because you do not have the staffing. And that's nothing new. In 2017, I allocated $3 million to NYCHA for Melrose houses. And I know Brian is here. I speak to Brian often. Brian, I have a lot of respect for you. We work together. It's unfortunate, that you have to answer these questions. But the $3 million that my office allocated in fiscal year 18 for Melrose houses, was that for cameras and layered access, was that project completed?
Councilmember, we have good news on that project. I've been looking forward to this day for a long time. So in November, those cameras will be turned on. In November, construction will be completed. So if we want to plan, something public to make, because I know those residents have been waiting for a very long time, and I know that you've been waiting for a long time. So it's we got there.
6 years.
Yes.
It took.
Yep.
So you to complete a project. Why does it take so long?
Yeah, thank you, Councilmember Salamanca, for the question. And I think, that's a project that unfortunately got caught up as our portfolio was growing and we were taking on new responsibilities and priorities around the HUD agreement. Some of the projects did not move nearly as quickly as we wanted. And you have been a continued advocate for us, both in terms of providing funding, but also holding us accountable to move this forward. And I want to add, at last year's hearing, after hearing from you, we went back and we identified 70 plus projects like this that had funding from 2017, 2018, 2019. We've made a very concerted effort to progress and close those off in the kind of 15 or 16 months since then. We have completed 30 of those 70. We have 28 in construction, and the remaining 14 or 15 are in design and procurement. So, based on your push, as well as obviously feedback from others, we have really tried to move forward any projects like that had money from several years back.
Because NYCHA works at such a snail pace on getting these projects, council-funded projects to move, we as a council, me as a council member, I don't feel confident in allocating any funding from my capital dollars to NYCHA, especially now that you're telling me that if I give you money in this upcoming budget, it's just going to sit there. Is that correct? Because you do not have the staff or the capacity to even plan these projects. So how can we help you if we're giving you the money and you're doing nothing with it?
Yeah, and I understand your frustration, and obviously the frustration residents may feel. I think there are two areas where you can help us, and this is the approach we took this year and we may take next year. We can leverage smaller sized projects where council members provide us expense funding to move very quickly with those typically, or we do continue to have projects, discretionary projects that remain underfunded and that require additional funding. Some of the reason that these projects do get held up is where the funding is not sufficient to meet the full scope of work that residents would like to see, and as we continue to advocate together with them. And so we can work with you to identify projects in your district that could utilize new funding additionally to meet resident demand quickly, and then ideally move those forward.
See, projects are underfunded because you give us a price tag 1 year, we give you the funding, you do nothing with it, prices go up, and then you turn around and you say you're underfunded on this project. And then we have to wait for the next fiscal year to allocate more funding so that we can cover that gap. And then you turn around and say, hey, you're underfunded again. This is a game you guys are playing with the lives of NYCHA residents. We as the council are doing our jobs. We're giving you the funding that you need, and you're not getting the work done. I call that incompetence. I just want to give you some data here. When I first got elected in 2016, NYCHA, and in 2017, the P&A was $45.3 billion. Today, it is $78.3 billion. It's more than state budgets throughout the United States of America. In Massachusetts, they just passed a state budget, $55.9 billion. The state of Louisiana, $47.7 billion. New Jersey, $54.3 billion. Connecticut, $51 billion. And NYCHA, in order for us to fix NYCHA and give our residents in the city of New York adequate housing, is $78.3 billion. Do you see an ending to this? Does NYCHA see an ending where they are going to get the funding necessary to address proper housing for New Yorkers?
I appreciate your question and for highlighting the magnitude of the need we have. I tried to lay out earlier that with our current tools that are available to us, we do hope that we can address almost half of that need utilizing those specific tools. Obviously, those programs require some level of state, city, and federal support as well, but they do generate a good amount of financing to be able to meet these critical needs for residents. The remainder of the need that's unaddressed through those programs, I think that's something we have to figure out together as we move forward. Can we scale those programs further? Are there other ways that we can address the needs?
Yeah. Look, I do understand that there needs to be a collective, you need help from the federal government. They need to do their part in giving you the funding that you need, and so does the state. But honestly, we as a council, and I think the feds are watching, City Council is giving NYCHA funding to address basic needs, and you're not doing anything with the funding that we're giving you. And maybe that's the problem why the federal government is hesitant to give you the funding that you need, because they feel that you may sit on it and the price may go up because nothing's getting done. My last question, how much funding did the City Council allocate to NYCHA in this last fiscal budget?
I think that we in the last fiscal budget, so the FY24 city budget, in terms of capital funding,
Yes.
is what you're referring to. I think we've been allocated something like $3 or $4 million. I have to check that number, but that's just my recollection from the discussions we've been having recently.
That's all the City Council gave you?
Yeah, council member, it was a very low number because we came to the council early, the committee, and also to leadership. But we, for the first time ever, we said, if you're going to invest in NYCHA, please give us operating dollars and not capital dollars, because you're 100% correct. Historically, we've had projects that have sat there for years and years, and for various reasons, and we, a project sitting there for until we feel confident that we can spend your money, we shouldn't be taking it, right? And so, and the other things that you had mentioned too. These are not just issues that are unique to NYCHA. If you look at the Philadelphia Housing Authority, the Chicago Housing Authority, the Puerto Rico Housing Authority, they are all facing the same issues. This is a nationwide issue. NYCHA is not unique in the fact that it has capital problems, and it is, and we are, like other housing authorities throughout the country, we're taking advantage where money is available. In fact, in a lot of ways, there is more local investment in NYCHA than there is in any of the other housing authorities that I mentioned. So, we are going after the dollars where they are. Unfortunately, a lot of it comes down to political will as well.
All right. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Chair, if you would give me the opportunity to make one comment, just to contextualize the helpful comments that Councilmember Salamanca made. I think the projects, the discretionary funded projects that we've had to pause are really critical in many ways. But at the same time, we are doing our best to move the capital portfolio forward. And to give that context, we are committing close to $1 billion a year and expending close to $1 billion a year. We are completing over 100 projects a year, similar to the CCTV project that will close off soon. And the paused projects account for less than 1% of our budget. And so, it's unfortunate that we don't have the capacity to move them forward just now. And at the same time, we've tried to minimize, any type of impact from our resource constraints as an organization on our ability to move the rest of the portfolio forward.
Thank you. It would be actually quite helpful to know. I know there has been a significant effort to move projects through the capital process, which was quite appalling years ago. But it would be great to see the list of capital projects that were completed with specifics, right? So that we can actually see and verify and get a sense of what is being completed in this large scope of work that's being demanded. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Deputy Speaker Ayala.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have a couple of questions and a lot on my mind, so I'm trying to put them all together in a way that they make sense. But of the estimated $78.3 billion does that number take into consideration does it account for buildings that are transitioning out through PACT and RAD?
That number only reflects buildings that have already transitioned out. But as we do our annual updates of the P&A going forward, whether buildings move out of our directly managed portfolio through PACT, through the trust, or whether we complete capital work, we'll be incorporating that in each annual update, and it'll be reflected there.
So theoretically, and correct me if I'm wrong, the $78 billion number would go down, right? Because the number of buildings within the portfolio would be significantly smaller.
That's right, Councilmember Ayala. Earlier on, we presented that if we were to work through the full PAC pipeline and through the trust allocation in the law, we would be able to address about half of that $78 billion need.
Okay, and I also, so could you explain to me what the cost differential is between PACT and the trust and the public trust plan? Because my understanding is, and again, correct me if I'm mistaken, but I've been here for a long time, so I think I remember it correctly. When we were sold on PACT, and not entirely sold, because I'm still on the cuff of it. I think it's okay for some buildings, but not for all. But I digress. The idea was that, when resident leaders were complaining about it feeling a little bit cosmetic in nature, the explanation that NYCHA gave at that time was that it was, but resources would be readily available, right? If, because it didn't make financial sense to rip up the whole building and gut rehab it. It's very expensive to do that, right? I understood that. That's a conversation I've had with my resident leaders. It's like, look, you're gonna get everything brand new, but the pipes in the wall are gonna be rotted out. It is what it is. That's a fact. When they burst, and they will, we have the resources to repair them immediately, right? And now, through the trust, is almost like the complete opposite, right? The conversation has shifted. No, we need to gut rehab these apartments. We're going to have to move folks out, which, calls into question the concerns about the vacancies, because if we're warehousing units to transition folks, theoretically, those apartments could be warehoused for many, many years. But my question is, what is the difference between PACT and the trust, like in terms of dollars?
So let me...
Because it seems like it's more expensive.
Well, let me try to talk to your point around what are our requirements around the scope of work, and then I'll also hand it to my colleagues to add more details. And some of those criticisms that were made, or observations early on that the PAC scopes of work may not have fully addressed what residents felt were the priority need, is something that we've addressed over the years by every year increasing our specifications to PAC developers around what exactly are the minimum state of repair for every type of asset or system in the building. And in fact, one of the things that we've been working on over the last year is to increasingly align our requirements, whether it's PACT, whether it would be the trust, or whether it's a capital project, that it's basically the same set of requirements for how we want to renovate, when you renovate, what quality you bring it to, what technologies you use. And so we have an integrated set of design requirements across those programs that we've been rolling out that would ensure that however NYCHA properties are being renovated, and by whoever is taking the lead on that, we're ensuring a minimum set of standards around quality and resident preference in that process. And so my point to you would be that those are all converging, and they already have been for several years. And we would expect to see that continue to happen going forward, whatever the model of renovation that we apply. Right, but I don't know if, Andrew, you want to add to that?
And the only other thing I would add, Councilmember, just on your question around the trust versus NYCHA versus PACT, because it's very early in the process, one of the things that we're expecting to get a better sense of is whether there are cost differentials between the different models. Just like with PACT, the starting point for the trust is the physical needs assessment. That's the best estimate that you have for a site, and then you do further investigations. And so with the trust, because of the procurement flexibilities that were authorized under the state law, we should have a better sense as we go through the first few sites, if they choose to opt into the trust, whether there's some sort of cost differential in that model.
I mean, I would imagine this, and I'm not, I'm not in that field, but I would imagine that there is a significant difference in cost, considering that you're gutting the entire unit. And I'm concerned about this because, if I was paying for this, right, I would want to, make really good use of those funds that are very limited at this point. So that part of it concerns me. But on the other end, we're facing a really serious housing crisis in New York City, and the idea of warehousing units that are desperately needed, when we could have opted for PACT, which is probably more cost efficient, and the easiest way to keep folks in their apartments without having to uproot them from their from their housing, their existing housing, and move them somewhere else for what could potentially be a year or even more. I mean, I'm sorry about about this, but NYCHA doesn't have the best, track record for doing things, expeditiously. So I'm concerned about that amount of time that people will be out of their homes. But, just really, if you could get back to us with kind of a sense of like what the cost differential is, I would appreciate that. And lastly, just out of curiosity, I was at Chelsea, Chelsea Houses a couple of weeks ago. I have family that lives there, and I realized that the developments don't seem to be as in bad condition as other developments that I have been to. And but that as I was walking around, I realized that that community is very upscale now. And I'm wondering, are we having conversations about tearing down those developments and creating more market because of the existing, inventory of housing that's in that community already? It didn't sit well with me while I was there.
So I can try to take a first stab at addressing your concern and your question. And very good question, obviously, and I'm glad you asked it. I think one of the challenges that the level of deterioration in older buildings is not always apparent kind of visually, right? So a lot of the issues that we're talking about in a place like Fulton Elliott Chelsea or other sites that are older or have a certain type of construction quality at the time are things that you find once you start to probe inside. Once you start to probe inside the walls, inside the roof structure and other areas, you realize that, we don't know what materials were used back then, and actually we can't identify them sometimes today, right? In Fulton Elliott Chelsea, we found electrical wiring that's wrapped in cloth and other types of very kind of old techniques of doing construction work, right? And so as you go deeper into the probing and inspections, you often find deteriorated conditions beyond what you would hope or what you would imagine. And I think that's part of what we've seen at a number of sites that were going through the PAC process, where a PAC partner has the resources to do that level of site investigation very deeply. They start to identify some of these more challenging conditions that aren't apparent from kind of any of us walking through the site and seeing that, right? So I think that's a big driver of what's happening there, rather than per se people anchoring around the fact that otherwise it may be an upscale neighborhood. Matt, do you want to add to that?
No, I mean, I just, Councilmember, just to your point on PAC 2, I don't think the repairs are cosmetic. We do plumbing replacement.
No, I'm not.
Yeah.
Listen, I'm not poo-pooing PAC.
Okay, yeah.
I've been to buildings. My residents are, in those buildings are really, they're happy with what they have. That's not what I'm questioning here. But I'm just concerned because I saw this happen at Metro North Houses, where we tore down buildings to create other types of housing that was Section 8 housing, and we didn't get all of the tenants, were not able to come back. Some of them opted to go into different NYCHAs, and for whatever reason, they had to requalify in order to get into these new buildings. And yes,
But there would be
Brian.
none of that here.
I see Brian shaking his head no,
Yeah.
but that was
The
true.
plan of-
I was there.
No, not there. I'm just saying in this project wouldn't be true.
Okay,
Yeah,
so
yeah.
that was one thing. But here you have upwards of 2,055 units, right, of Section 9. So we would tear them down and build 2,500 units, primarily market rate.
No, well, it would be, I mean, I think the most important part of the only reason to do it really is to build new housing for the current residents. So all the current residents would have new
So there would be
apartment,
no market
same
rate.
s- Sorry?
There would
No,
be
there
no
would be
market
market rate for sure, because we want
What
to
is the
build new
ratio?
housing. We want
What
to
is the
build new.
ratio for a market and affordable?
So I think we can come back to you on the exact numbers, Councilmember Lyon, but the total number of units is significantly larger after the redevelopment.
That's
So
fine, that's great, but
You'll
it
be
doesn't, if
fully
it doesn't.
protecting all of the Section 9 units with dedicated units for all of those families.
I understand, but if you're uprooting families from Chelsea Elliott that have been there forever, and I lived in public housing, and I'll tell you that my neighbors then are still neighbors now to my brother who continues to live there. There's a family, right, that's created, and so you're gonna uproot people. And when I'm standing there and I'm looking around at all these beautiful high-rise buildings, I'm thinking the only thing that doesn't look the same here is Chelsea Elliott. And that bothers me. That bothers me that we would prioritize, tearing down that development. And I'm not saying that those tenants don't deserve to live in good quality housing and that the repairs don't need to be made, but I do question the type of housing that is being proposed. And I do worry, and I'm sure that residents that live there will be uprooted and sent elsewhere to make space for more market rate. And that is not acceptable. That is not something that I will support ever. And I think that we need to be honest, in our conversations when we're doing things so that at least we know where we're standing. Don't try to sell to me, this proposal as an, affordable housing, and, we're so concerned about the state of, Chelsea Elliott, when in fact, the apartments that we're gonna be replacing them with are not for the people that live there. So it doesn't make any sense to me. So, we can discuss it. I just want to really go on record saying that because, it was really heartbreaking to be there and see that. And it was so evident that, you literally have to be, visually impaired to not see what I saw when I was there. And it's horrible that in New York City, we would be complicit in doing that. So, I would wait for the numbers on the cost differential between the PACT and the proposed trust, because I think that there is a significant difference. So I look forward to hearing about that. And as some of my colleagues have mentioned, the number of units that are currently being what I call warehoused, that are being reserved for those transitions. Because I think that there's a difference, right, between how many we're going to need to move folks out and around at some point. And with that, thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. It sounds like a hearing is in order potentially around Chelsea Fulton Elliott. Yes, thank you. I would like the Zoom to be unmuted for Councilmember Barron, who would like to make a quick statement. It's just to make a
Thank you
statement.
very much. Could you hear me, Madam Chair?
Yes.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. I'm a little under the weather, so I'll be right there with you. But we have a very, very serious problem in public housing. For the record, for the last couple of decades, I've been totally against the privatization of public housing, totally against shifting the emphasis on Section 9 to Section 8. I've been totally against the RAD and PAT program. I don't trust the trust. And I think that, as with Councilmember Ayala just mentioned, I see the privatization also reserving apartments for market rate people that we can't afford in our districts or in our communities. I saw some of the transitions, and I sat through most of the meetings, through the process of many of my developments being converted or changed over to RAD and PAT. In the process, they threatened many of the residents with being evicted if they didn't sign on to it. Many of them were fearful of that. They threatened rent hikes and all of this stuff. And when we were on several occasions trying to speak against it, and we were promoting resident management, let the residents manage these buildings and provide the city, state, and federal money for the residents to manage their own facilities. Now, I know a lot of people say, well, the state hasn't done this for all of these years, the feds haven't done it, and the city hasn't done their fair share, so we are privatizing. Well, some of the residents say, before we privatize and before you make me victims of privatization and at the mercy of private entities, I'd rather keep fighting for the public money, my taxpaying dollars, to come my way. So for the record, I'm against RAD, I'm against PAT, and I'm against the trust. I don't trust these things for our residents. And some of it was superficial commercial stuff made up. As a matter of fact, in one of the residents, in my district, we talked about the piping, and they said they're not gonna change all the piping, just a small percentage of it. So, places like Linden houses and Boulevard houses and Florentine and some of the other developments in my district. I know Pink houses are debating whether they should do it or not, and the Cypress houses are debating whether they should do it or not. Penn Workman, those places that we have a real serious challenge. And I firmly believe that if we had more confidence and faith in our residents, in the city that has a $107 billion expense budget and 100 and some odd, 60 some odd billion dollar 10-year capital budget, why the hell can't we have some money for public housing? Talking about 78 billion, if you match the city, the state, and the feds' capital money, that is more than enough there to take care of our residents in public housing. I quite frankly don't think that the state, city, or feds, and not even the private companies that you're leasing these properties out to or having managed them, have any respect for Black and brown people who are in low-income public housing. They have no respect whatsoever. We have a lot of complaints through the RED. We had hearings, not hearings, we had meetings, that all of the complaints about the conversions, about sometimes, and as you know, in Linden houses, some of the workers actually broke into one of the apartments, messed up the man's place, and we're still trying to find out who did it, and lied and said that, you know, someone else, it was a mistake, he was on the wrong list and all of that. There are a lot of problems with this transition to privatization.
Thank you.
So just as, I'm almost finished. Just as we have concerns about privatizing healthcare and privatizing housing and privatizing education, this benefits a predatory capitalist system more than it does the struggling tenants of public housing. So thank you, Madam Chair, for allowing me to say these few words. And I know we're getting into the detail stuff, but don't forget the macro picture. We have to keep public housing public and not privatize it. Let the residents manage their facilities where they live. That would be the best solution. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Councilmember Barron. Thank you. Always appreciate your voice and perspective. So now to move into all the questions I didn't get to ask. Can you walk us through the changes in methodology between the 2017 and 2023 P&A and why those changes were made?
Thank you for the question, Chair Aviles. I think in terms of methodology changes, obviously one of the changes was to use a sampling-based approach and to focus on 30 developments, but that account for about 20% of our apartments. And the major reason we made that change was because we found, this is an industry practice, but also we realized that our plan in 2017 of doing such an extensive exercise was to then be able to use that data in the future more efficiently and effectively. So we believe the sampling-based approach is kind of the best trade-off in terms of giving us accurate information and at the same time, preserving funding that we could be using in other places. So, the P&A exercise in 2023 utilized significantly less funding for the assessment itself than we had used in 2017, leveraging that data we had. In particular, I think what you highlighted earlier, that the critical needs, the 5-year needs, have grown because many assets are now past their useful life. We recognized that in 2017 and saw that there's limited utility to sending all these inspection teams out to basically confirm what we knew in 2017, is that asset, would be beyond its life in 2 to 3 years. So basically, just to use our resources prudently, we made that methodology change. Other methodology changes we made related to how we account for assets that you can inspect visually, right? Because a P&A is such a massive exercise across so many properties, it would be extremely cost prohibitive and resource intensive if we were going to be doing deep dive probing in the walls and inspections at every site. So in 2017, we really couldn't add that element at that scale. So in 2023, because we were sampling a smaller number of properties, we then did do some amount of work like that where we opened up walls, we looked at the internal elements in the kitchens, the bathrooms, we looked at piping, plumbing of different types of systems. And that allowed us to get a better sense of how those assets were deteriorating more or less than what the technical teams had assumed in 2011 or 2017 when they weren't actually able to look behind the walls. And that led to a larger amount of need being identified around plumbing and some of these behind-the-wall systems. So those were the two largest methodology changes that we made in this exercise, and that's reflected in some of the results.
Got it. So in terms of the 30 sites that you looked at that represent about 28,000 apartments, the percentage to overall housing for the number of respondents, is that 20% as well?
So the 29,000 apartments that those 30 developments comprise is, I think, something like 18% of the total 161,000 units that we're managing directly today.
Got it. I almost confused myself on that question. You mentioned industry standard. I guess I have a hard time understanding that given the scope of NYCHA and seeing no other collective that way. So like how are we applying an industry standard when NYCHA is not the standard?
Sure. And I think that's a great question. Thank you for asking that. Yes, we are a very large property manager, nationally and globally. But even smaller property managers who maintain a variety of properties have to do both long-term capital planning and they have to do kind of more short-term inspections and maintenance and repair work. And so a similar approach is typically used to have some consistent methodology to go out and inspect sites and do that kind of longer-term capital planning exercise and collect that information. And typically, again, like what we've adopted in 2023, these other property owners would not be going out and necessarily inspecting every site exhaustively every 5 years. And one of the big benefits of that is that you save some money to then do more frequent annual inspections on specific asset types, right? Mm-hmm. So for example, in NYCHA's context in the past, roofs have been a real challenge in terms of leaks and things. So we now do biannual inspections of every roof to see the condition, to call in warranters to fix it. And we're able to fund things like that and these more frequent type of inspections rather than doing a more expansive 5-year exercise, but may not be responsive to the actual repair work that we can do on an annual basis. So in terms of industry practice, the use of a sampling approach and the kind of balancing of these more comprehensive portfolio-wide exercises versus more targeted annual work is kind of what we're referring to.
Got it. How much did it cost? How much did the 2023 P&A cost?
The 2023 P&A for the inspections, the analysis, and the reporting in our internal databases that we get from the technical consultants cost just under $6 million.
Is that the total cost over the 5-year period? Because it's a 5-year contract.
That's right. That doesn't include some of the annual updates that we'll be getting, and it doesn't include some of the. So one of the things that we are also engaging the technical vendor on is helping us to launch a public portal that provides P&A data to residents and other stakeholders in a very user-friendly way, integrated with our capital projects information. So that's another big component. So if we put all of that in, I think the total contract is about $9 million.
Okay. And in terms of integration with the public portal, it seems like one would imagine an enormous amount of overlap. Is this a whole separate system? Another database we got to look at?
No. So what we're trying to do, so last year, I think, as you know, we launched a capital projects tracker, I think of April of 2022. And over the last 15 months, we've received a lot of feedback from residents and other stakeholders of both the tracker being quite useful in various ways, but ways that we could enhance it. And so we have been tabulating all of those enhancements and prioritizing them and combining them with integrating the P&A information directly into that web tracker. So now there will be hopefully a very user-friendly tool that replaces that as a kind of version 2. And not only does it include a range of new features that residents have flagged to us, it will integrate in the P&A information. Yeah.
Got it, thank you. And can you, what was the 2017, what was the cost of the 2017 P&A?
The 2017 P&A cost us $23 million. That didn't include, obviously, these features like annual updates, public portal and things like that.
Those features were not part of the 23 million?
No.
Or were they conducted, is that correct?
Sorry, in 2017, those
2017,
features
huh.
were not part of the exercise at the time.
That's correct. Okay, thank you. What is the background of the firm or firms that conducted the P&A?
Sure. So when we do a P&A, we go through a public procurement process to procure firms that have both the technical capacity and experience and the kind of resource base to do an intensive exercise like this in a short period of time. And so through the public procurement we did about starting a year and a half ago, we ended up procuring a joint venture between AECOM, which is a global project management, construction management, architecture, engineering services firm, and STV, which is also a very large firm in that space in the US. And so they jointly have been doing the work for us since they started the inspections late last year, and then this year the analytics, the report, and then working with us on the portal.
Is STV or AECOM a RAD-PAC developer?
I
don't believe that they're involved.
No.
They're not a developer per se, and I don't
STV
think
does
they're
some work
involved.
with us on kind of similar services. They do, I don't know that they've done a CNA for us yet, but they do some construction monitoring, but they're not part of the development team.
So they've done construction monitoring on RAD-PAC?
Correct.
But not a developer themselves? Okay.
Correct.
Is there, I guess, under the guise of conflict of interest and or firewalls, could they become a RAD-PAC developer?
I'm not positive, but I don't think they do development work.
Okay.
We would definitely not work with them on the construction monitoring for PACT if they were a developer. But yeah, I don't think they do development work.
Okay. Okay, so one data point that was found by staff during our review of the P&A was particular uniformity in the growth of the need in elevators across NYCHA developments, and only a single development saw a drop in the need of elevators against the 2017 P&A, as elevators are a particular focus of the monitor's agreement, and as we've known in past testimony. Can you give us your understanding of the almost uniform growth in the elevator?
Sure. So yeah, the growth in the elevator needs from 2017 to 2023 is about 85%, right? So the total need across the portfolio was about $2.5 billion. It moved to $4.5 billion. For each development, it was typically around that 85% number, as you mentioned. And partly because it's a pretty consistent feature of each building, and partly because the installation of many of those elevators happened at the same time, 20, 25 years ago. However, there was variance, right? And so even though the average and many of the developments were somewhere in the 80 to 90% range of increased need, there were developments in the kind of 40% as well as the 140% range. And so there's a variety of there. And what can determine that? Well, a couple things can impact that. One is obviously when the elevators were installed and how much they've deteriorated. A second one is the elevator technology. We largely used what are called traction elevators, but some of our sites have hydraulic elevators or other technologies, as well as replacement, right? So the one site that you referred to that had a much lower growth, that's because we've replaced half of the elevators between 2017 and 2023. So when they did the inspection, they reflected the fact that half are replaced. The other half are actually being replaced and will be completed soon as well. And so what that reflects is that while we do have a large elevator pipeline from the HUD agreement, the completion of those projects really just started to come in at the end of 2022. We currently have upwards of, I think, 220 elevators in construction. So as those projects close off, and we have another pipeline of about 300 elevators that we've started, those needs across all the developments will start to decrease.
And the timeframes for those are generally, when you say in construction, how long, what's the timeframe we're talking about?
Yeah, so the majority of the first kind of what we call our first tranche of elevators that were specified under the HUD agreement and funded at the time by the city and the state and through federal funding are meant to close off by the end of 2024. The second tranche of funding we received from the state is currently in early design, and those projects will complete between 2026 and 2028.
Got it. In terms of, during an earlier presentation on the PNAs, there was ongoing updates to be performed by STV and ACOM, which consisted, as you mentioned, update on pricing and building out of the internal website, as you also mentioned, and a tool for internal compliance. Could you flesh out the descriptions for these?
Yes, so the technical consultants will be doing an annual update in the first quarter of each year, and then we'll be making that available publicly through this new portal that they're supporting us on. That will involve updating, bringing in the new market price data in particular, as well as reflecting what we touched upon earlier, where capital work has been completed, reducing the need numbers associated with that. If a site has converted through PACT or through the trust, reflecting that in what we put out publicly, and other updates, on an annual basis. So that's one piece of work they're doing. The second piece of work is the portal that we've been speaking about, where they will be, not only have they helped us to build that out, they will be also ensuring that gets updated on an annual basis. So as we update the information underlying, making sure that that flows through into the portal. The third piece, I think, rather than an internal compliance tool, they have developed a internal kind of capital planning tool that really leverages the P&A information along with other information that we have available from our operations colleagues to inform capital planning and prioritization. And this is a standard kind of software offering that these firms have for owners to utilize, which they've made available to us with our data, and allows us to prioritize, just given the scarcity of funding we have relative to our need, right? We typically do, very clearly prioritize compliance, safety and security, and health issues. But, if we either are able to mobilize more funding or through some of these other programs, be more creative, then that type of sophisticated capital planning tool can be quite useful for us.
And does that prioritization get put out publicly, those commitments of what the work plan is going to actually be within those fiscal years?
Yeah, that's right. So our annual capital plan that we release, our board approves and gets released publicly, lays out the investments in each property and each scope area that we're planning to do for the next 5 years. And
but doesn't show like the actual investments, doesn't show like elevators and Red Hook, and
it does. It shows
aggregate
the development, elevators, and the dollar amount that'll go in each year.
Okay, great. In terms of in terms of the annual updates, will that include actual inspections, and will that only be of the portion that was sampled, or will that be development-wide?
No, the annual updates won't include any inspections to inform the P&A specifically. And I think that's consistent with the point of a P&A and this approach of having a kind of magnitudinal capital investment perspective across the property. As I've highlighted earlier, we do a range of other things internally to inspect, to identify any urgent needs, and then to allocate funding and address them. And so where we do learn about major capital investment needs, we will be trying to integrate that into these P&A updates. But for the most part, there's no dedicated inspections for the P&A updates themselves. I will highlight one other point as something we've started and addresses some of the comments that were made earlier by the resident panel. Something that we started this year in February. We now visit each property at least twice a year, and we're targeting 4 times a year. We sit with the resident leader and with the property manager and their staff, and we talk about what their priorities are. In addition to giving them a comprehensive update of all ongoing and planned capital projects at that site. And then we maintain a tracker that we can say at any given time, this TA leader has said these are their top 3 priorities for investment in their site. And so we can bring that into our prioritization process and discussions, more actively than we have been able to in the past because we weren't able to maintain that data in a systematic way. And so this is one of the major efforts we've made to ensure that we always have in mind what residents see as their major needs at the site that could require capital investment as opposed to, smaller scale repairs.
I certainly appreciate that that work. I would beg to include maybe local elected officials in that, and also understand that while TA presidents, bless their heart, are doing yeoman's effort, I'm not sure that information is actually getting out to residents in the way that would, reflect a meaningful engagement and actually just say, really, our residents are behind this 100%. We have a lot of work to do in that area. In terms of the annual, can you tell us what the schedule is going to be in terms of the update to the pricing from STV and ACOM?
I can come back to you with the specifics around that after the hearing. We have agreed that the updates would happen in the first quarter using kind of end-of-year pricing from the last year, but we haven't agreed, or I'm not remembering if we have a specific schedule of the work being released publicly each year, and so we can come back to you with that.
Got it. And first quarter on the calendar year, or
yes, first quarter of the calendar year. Sorry.
No, that's quite all right. In terms of, we see the short-term need again. We've discussed this, over $36 billion in the next 12 months. Actually, we've talked about this. We'd like to see what the plan is and how projects will get prioritized.
So I think this goes back to your earlier question, if I remember, around our capital strategy and our prioritization. And I think, obviously it's important to keep in mind that our capital resources represent maybe about 5% of that 20-year need, and something like 8 to 10% of even that 5-year critical need. And so we're always working very hard to understand, given that limited resource base, where that funding should really go. And I mentioned a bit earlier that for the last few years, 90% of our capital plan, maybe a little bit more than that, is fully dedicated to meeting our HUD agreement commitments around boiler replacements, elevator replacements, lead abatement, and other specific areas. And so to some degree, we really haven't had much flexibility to allocate our capital funding outside of those areas, but those are the critical areas that we feel need to be addressed to really meet safety, quality of life, health type of issues that residents face day to day. And obviously one of the other areas that is not in the HUD agreement that we've really prioritized is security. Again, so going forward, assuming that we're able to continue to receive capital investment funding in the order that we have in the last few years because of the HUD agreement, then we would have more space to then think about, are there other asset classes or types that we really need to focus on in the properties. Though, as you saw in the P&A, these areas like heating and elevators continue to be areas that require a lot more funding to make our way through the whole portfolio. So I guess what I'm saying in short is, I think, we always need to balance between these strategic areas like heating, elevators, and waste, and other aspects, at the same time respond to some of these more urgent resident needs that are being flagged to us. And we're also, at the same time dealing with, emergencies that happen at our sites where we have to make capital investments. And between that, we're typically able to very quickly fully allocate all the funding we have, unfortunately.
In terms of we noted that coming out of the 2017 PNA, there was 31 billion in critical need. So it's clear that since 2017, we knew this need was not being met. How much has the administration contributed towards this short-term need at the last adopted budget?
So the last adopted budget being the one that was just adopted recently in July?
Yep.
So there hasn't been a new allocation of capital funding for us in that budget, though it's important to highlight that we're continuing to work through the very sizable allocation that was made after the HUD agreement, right? So the city allocated over $3 billion over 10 years, an initial $2.2 billion, and an additional billion to come in some of the out years. We continue to commit and expend that funding right now. Our current budget for the fiscal year is over $1 billion, and so we plan to commit a good portion of that, and obviously we're expending funding that we've committed in the past. So, the city has generously provided these resources over the last few years, and we continue to work through them, for many of our priority core programs.
I appreciate that very full response, and all I heard was the city hasn't committed new dollars at adopted, despite knowing that there's more than 31 billion in new needs of 2017. Although I will acknowledge that the city has been making effort and certainly much more generous than our state level investments have been. But given our current state of affairs and our $160 billion city capital budget, there's no excuse other than a clear policy, a clear decision to not fund NYCHA properly. So I guess with that, what is NYCHA's plan if the federal government shuts down next week, given that we've heard about the diminishing returns and the state of reserves?
Sure. So we've had conversations with HUD about a possible shutdown, and we've been assured that on the public housing side that we would continue to receive operating funds for October and November, and payments to landlords would be made on the Section 8 side, for October. If we go through a longer shutdown than that, we'll have to reassess. But, in the short term, we seem to be okay.
Just in case. In terms of how does partial funding of ERAP by the state impact the PNA, considering the money came in after the survey period? And does it have a positive impact on existing capital needs?
Do you want to take that?
I can give you an update where we are with ERAP, and then maybe, Sean, you could say how that could, help on your side. So, as you know, the state allocated about $165 million, about $135 million of that was in ERAP funding. The other, about approximately $30 million was in additional funding for rent arrears. We've been having conversations with OTDA, since the budget passed. A lot of, mechanics to work through. They also had a leadership change, but, I'm happy to report that we submitted, 10,000, what we believe are confident first batch of necessary documents for tenants to start getting payment, and we believe that result in somewhere between $50 and $70 million in payment for residents to see relief. And Sean, maybe you could talk about how that additional funding could help your area.
Sure. Well, obviously, the ERAP funding, which is very beneficial for us, feeds into our operating budget by replacing or compensating for some of the rent arrears that we've built up over time. It doesn't make any direct contribution in our capital budget, and it's not capital funding per se. However, by reducing some of the challenges we face and the shortfall we face on the operating budget, it does put less pressure on my area in terms of my ability to staff and manage projects effectively. And so I think that is always helpful. It doesn't necessarily mean that we can accelerate our work given that we continue to face an arrears challenge.
Has the P&A factored in funding from federal and state sources that aim to achieve climate goals? For example, the $70 million aimed at the installation of heat pumps in public housing.
So any of the funding that we've already secured is not necessarily factored in the P&A $78 billion, but it is factored in what we presented in terms of how we plan to address the needs. And so something like the money around the heat pumps that you referenced, or others where we've committed funding from a source, we have included as addressing some portion of the need going forward. We have not prospectively made assumptions around securing additional funding, even though we're extremely active, as you heard earlier, on putting in applications and trying to secure some of that funding.
You mentioned, we talked a lot about prioritization, and I heard you say, critical, like safety first, which I agree. But can you flesh that out a little bit more for the record? What's the criteria that you would use to determine what is going to get prioritized with the capital resources that we have?
Sure. So maybe starting with safety and security, what is in that bucket beyond things like heating and life safety related to that, or elevators, or what we've talked about around hazardous materials, around lead-based paint abatement or mold or things like that.
That's like everything.
Yeah. So those are the other areas within safety and security. We're specifically targeting CCTV, layered access controlled, building entrance and exit security, fire safety systems around the buildings. And elements like that. We also would be looking at, any kind of unsafe conditions that require capital investment. So, if we have significant deterioration of a roof and beyond leaks, we know that that may lead to structural issues in the building. That would also be prioritized as part of our kind of safety and security bucket. We may also include other campus-level security improvements like exterior lighting and other elements that residents may feel are critical for them to feel safe on the campus.
Got it. Now, switching over, actually, if we could ask you, Mr. Honan, a resident would like to know, could you, for the record, explain what CCOP is?
Sure. It's the Citywide Council of Presidents. It is, so the city is broken up into districts, and in these, each of the districts elect a leader to represent them on the Citywide Council of Presidents. There are 10, it's represented by 10 leaders geographically throughout the city.
And the leaders are elected annually, every 3 years. What's the time frame?
It is not annually. I think it's I believe it's a 4-year term. 3 to 4 year term. Yeah, it's their bylaws. It's in the bylaws.
And where can one find more information about CCOP?
Sure. I think their bylaws are online, but we definitely, and I know we've shared those with the council too.
Everything's online, you just can't find it.
I know.
Yeah. Thank you. In terms of just taking a quick shift back to RAD Pact, can you share what the rubric is for selecting developments for RAD and the trust? Actually, what is the rubric that is being used to make those decisions?
So historically, before the introduction of the trust legislation, we engage with residents at each site and tenant leadership, often demand-based where they've requested that engagement or otherwise, and have a lengthy engagement process. And this is our historic model that you've heard about in the past, where we're engaging intensively at a site where there's interest in exploring RAD Pact, doing education with residents around what that might mean for them, and then moving into the RADPAC process. And that's how the bulk of the pipeline that either has converted already or is in kind of the public engagement and pre-development phase today has been set, and the process we've gone through. With the introduction of the trust and ongoing conversations about PAC, we largely respond to resident demand. So where resident leadership would like to explore one or the other model or both models, we obviously don't want to refuse that, and we would try to be responsive to resident leadership as much as we can and support whatever discussions they'd like to have with the broader resident community and with other stakeholders on those programs.
So there's no rubric that is used prior to resident engagement and asking them if they're interested in either of these approaches?
I mean, I think need is definitely, we look at the needs of the developments, but all of our developments are in need. And looking back, the PAC program now is, I think the 2016 was Ocean Bay, which was obviously impacted by Hurricane Sandy, so that was in its own situation. And then there were developments that were, kind of known as the unfundeds or had some different funding strategy than our traditional public housing. And then there was our scattered sites, which are traditionally hard to operate and manage. So I think the site selection has evolved over the time. To the point where we are today, which it is largely based on resident request. We're not at the point where we're forcing PAC on anyone at this point. If the resident leadership isn't interested, we'll work with developments that are, because the need is so great at all of our developments.
Yeah, I'm not suggesting that there's any forcing. I've heard different stories, and I think you mentioned that it has been evolving over time. But it's curious that NYCHA has all the information of the status of the developments and their individual needs, and is saying that it's largely just driven, that the approach is largely driven by resident engagement. And then you ask residents, and they actually don't know what these options are. So there is definitely a disconnect in that approach.
So 100% it has evolved over time. I think there was a time where we looked at scattered sites. We were looking at smaller developments because they weren't managed or get the attention that they wanted. Over time, that changed. And I think Matt is 100% correct. I don't think there is a development in the entire portfolio that cannot use a substantial amount of investment. Where I think we have changed our approach is we are going to, at least as a starting point, developments that, where there is an interest, from first the resident association, and then we build our way out, So in the property that we are now conducting an election at Nostrand Houses, and the rules around voting, state this, that the first place we have to go before we even talk to anyone about these, a possible election is to the resident association. We say we think this would be a good site for an election. We hear what they say. If the residents say we're not interested, we're not going to do it. We can go on to the next property, where we have that interest. But in the properties where we are having conversations, it usually is in places where the tenants have come forward and said, I'm interested in doing this. We are not pushing, and as I invite any member of the council to please come out to Nostrand Houses, come to the meetings. We are not pushing one idea over the other. The thing that we're pushing is turnout. We're presenting all three ideas in an even-handed way. And we're making contact with residents either through meetings, phone calls, door knocking. We're doing events, and we're presenting all three ideas get equal time, and we're doing all of our meetings in 5 different languages as well.
I'd like to turn it over to Councilmember Brewer.
Excellent questions, Madam Chair. Scatter site, I should know this, but does the P&A include scatter site, brownstones, et cetera? In other words, when you're doing the evaluations?
In general, yes. The vast majority of scatter sites or other types of developments or buildings we may have are included in the P&A.
Okay. And second, once I have Wise Towers, not the best packed developer, once it gets converted, as I guess the term is, then would the P&A still be evaluating the conversion 10 years from now, 5 years from whatever?
No, the NYCHA P&A does not. We do, HDC does annual inspections. We do monthly work order data checking. We do resident surveys that we're rolling out to do annually to converted developments.
Once it's converted, though?
Well, after
it's
conversion.
So all that will be taking place?
All that's after the repairs are done, like at Wise Towers. And then we do require at minimum, they do another P&A every 20 years. Assuming that the 20-year need has been met through the pact, and we can request one sooner if we need to.
Okay, so, but it won't be part of this process that you're talking about?
Sorry, which process?
The
is that?
P&A, in other words, once it's converted?
Right, it's not, it won't be part of the NYCHA P&A.
That's what I'm asking.
That's right, correct.
Okay. And then the other question I have is, the chair has been asking so articulately, but how does whatever Mr. Schwartz is doing with his vast amounts of money, and the P&A, in other words, Mr. Schwartz is saying this and that, he mostly focuses on, as I understand it, lead and mold. So how does that, what he says, and maybe this got answered earlier, I apologize, I was doing a Zoom, into the P&A, if at all?
So a portion of the federal monitor's team is focused only on the capital side of NYCHA and works with us very intensively,
right.
Week by week, month by month. I had a meeting with
More
them
than
this
you
morning.
ever want, yes.
And so
I can say that, you can't. Go ahead.
No, definitely. So their primary focus is on the specific HUD agreement commitments we have around delivery of specific assets. At the same time, they are broadly involved in our organizational enhancement initiatives, and they input to things like this where they didn't have a formal role in overseeing the technical consultants who do the P&A, but we discussed the P&A, we discussed capital prioritization, and they do have a role in looking at our work over the last 2 years of how we do this exercise and how it feeds into the way we utilize federal money moving forward, right? And so they're looking at both our effectiveness on the specific projects in the HUD agreement, and at the same time, they're providing us technical expertise, sometimes reviewing work that's coming out and giving us feedback on how to improve it or how to work with technical consultants.
Okay, it sounds complicated, but it sounds like it's working, I guess, in terms of collaboration and coordination.
I think that's right, and I think that we're moving to a phase where the federal monitor team can increasingly support us through technical capacity. We've moved away maybe from a phase where we were just trying to figure out what challenges we have and how to move past them. And so, for example, over the last 3 months, the capital part of the monitor team has helped us to develop a training program for our capital staff and roll that out to upwards of 130 staff now. And so we are collaborating on efforts like that to increase our capability and capacity.
Congratulations. And then on the P&A, Wagner Houses, I'm making this up, needs a roof, Wrangell needs elevators, et cetera. So you don't have to do an entire development. You can do the most, I guess, prioritizing. Is that how it works? In other words, is that how it works?
That's exactly right. So the bulk of our capital portfolio, today and going back many years, is focused on that, where we have a view on all those assets at Wrangell or anywhere, but we may only be doing the roof or only doing the heating or only doing the elevators based on. So when we think about prioritization, we're thinking about what is the asset, the next important asset to do at any given development, just given the state of how it's operating, if there's any emergencies, et cetera. And so, we don't only have to decide, well, which heating system is more important than the other. We have to compare the heating to the roof, to the elevator, to the whatever, to figure out where that priority is.
Okay, and even when you have the new federal money, it's the same process?
That's right, so any funding we get, that's the process we would like to use. Now, a lot of the new funding opportunities that were mentioned today are tied to specific types of investments.
That's what I was wondering. So it could be tied to the roof, or it could be tied to the heating system, or something like that.
That's right. So if some of the, for example, some of the sustainability funding it may be tied to, energy efficiency around solar, but they're willing to pay for the roof as well.
Okay.
Right? And so for us, it would tick both of the boxes, but we would, it's kind of earmarked in how we can utilize it.
All right. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. I'd like to know, thank you, Council Member. I'd like to know, can you tell us about the implications of this 5th round of proposed cuts that the mayor announced?
So I think this is something that we're working through with the city and with OMB. We've just received the letter, and we'll be trying to understand how we can best achieve those savings. At this point, we don't see any direct impact on today's topic of our P&A and our capital work.
I suppose that will change very soon. In terms of work that is currently in the pipeline as it relates to the P&A. So, for instance, if there were work in process at a development, is that considered in the P&A?
So the threshold we use is that the work has to be completed and the asset delivered. So once the work is completed, then it gets basically reduced from the need, right? And so this is why those annual updates are critical, because we have so many projects completing each year. After they complete, we can make sure we then reflect that in the next year's view, right? So maybe to be specific, at the time of the inspections last year, if the work was in progress but hadn't completed, the need would still be represented in the $78 billion. But once that actual work, whatever that is, completes, then we'll be reducing it.
And do you have a sense of how much of the work, let's say you expect to be completed within a year, would fall off of the books?
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier that on our capital side, we expend just under $1 billion a year, but that's across many projects that could be completing or could be midway, right? So if we're expending some of that on a project that's still not completed ongoing, so somewhere in that range of potentially something like $300 to $500 million a year, we're able to take off of the need through our capital projects delivery.
Got it. Thank you. I think with that, we would like to conclude this hearing. I want to thank the staff for coming. Oh, we're moving to public testimony, excuse me. Thank you for being here, responding to our questions. I look forward to receiving responses to some of the things we were not able to discuss, like a clear list of the projects that were completed, an understanding of how things are prioritized, the rubric that is being used for a selection of RAD Pact and trust beyond a TA president requested it. I think those would all be very helpful. And I guess, yes, we'll turn it over to public testimony. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll now move on to public testimony. For those wishing to testify in person, if you have not already done so, please see the Sergeant at Arms in the back of the room and fill out a testimony slip. Even if you registered online, please still fill out a testimony slip with the sergeants. For those wishing, those who are on Zoom and wishing to testify, after the in-person testimony is completed, we will move on to virtual testimony. As we do that, those on Zoom will be called, and a prompt to unmute yourself will appear on your computer. All those testifying, either in person or virtually, are encouraged to submit testimony at council.nyc.gov/testimony or via email at testimony@council.nyc.gov. I'll call up the first panel for public testimony. If you could come to the dais. Luz Chile, Crystal Glover, and Christina Chase. You may begin when ready.
I think it's a little disrespectful that I stayed and waited to hear NYCHA and then they just leave when residents come talk. My name is Christina Chase. I am second vice president of the Ravenswood Houses Resident Association and also an advocacy coordinator at Take Root Justice. I actually did read the physical needs assessment, and at least in my perspective, I think it's impossible to compare the 2023 physical needs assessment to NYCHA's 2017 physical needs assessment because of the inflation and construction costs, or what they call the market rate escalation, which blows the price tag of capital needs by $18.9 billion across the next 5 years and $27.8 billion across the next 20 years. Moreover, NYCHA's 2017 P&A entailed inspections of 10 to 15% of units at each and every development. At the time, that was 325 developments, whereas the 2023 P&A sampled 10 to 15% of units across only 30 developments. Out of 264 at current, and used a mathematical deterioration curve model to calculate the numbers for the rest of the developments. These numbers are incomparable, and we do not trust the validity of this assessment. Residents do not want pages of data modeling and statistical extrapolation methods. They want real and accurate data regarding their respective developments. That being said, we want an independent physical needs assessment of each and every development, no matter the costs, in language that is accessible and without bias, so we can make informed decisions. Projections of capital needs for NYCHA's financialization projects packed in the Preservation Trust positions this report to serve as an advocacy platform for privatization as a cost reduction strategy. See pages 20 to 24. P&As should only include the inspection procedures and costs for repair and rehabilitation. It is quite clear that NYCHA intends to utilize this P&A report to justify further privatization of public housing stock. As we saw in Chelsea Elliott and Fulton Houses, the huge increase from $344,330,847 in the 2017 P&A to $835, so let's double, more than double, $1,697,211 in the 2023 P&A was used to justify the demolition of thousands of homes and was used as a reason to hand over public housing land to wealthy private financialized developers like Essence and Related, who own multiple properties in the area. NYCHA's P&A holds more significance now more than ever before because it is one of several materials residents will receive if and when it comes time to vote on the future of their homes. According to the Preservation Trust voting procedures, this is one of the many materials that residents are supposed to receive to make these fully informed decisions. However, these misleading numbers should not be used for justifying privatization via Section 8 conversions, as alluded to in the report, but rather a call for deep public investment at all levels of governance. Although residents need, want, and deserve comprehensive repairs, it should not be at the cost of their Section 9 lease. Our homes are not for sale to real estate developers. If we know we cannot depend on federal government to fund Section 9 public housing, we must call upon city and state officials to support public housing and the families that live within. We need our city council to help rehabilitate public housing units and ensure we keep public housing public. We have more than enough evidence to demonstrate why there's mistrust of NYCHA, decades of capital negligence, patterns of little to no accountability, and a track record of mismanagement and disregard. Because of this legitimate mistrust, we cannot put our faith into this physical needs assessment. We are calling on the state to commission an independent physical needs assessment of all NYCHA developments and the City Council to ensure residents receive timely repairs without having to convert to Section 8. Lastly, this is a call for Section 9 public housing to be fully funded at all 3 levels of government, as it is the most secure avenue of housing stability for over 176,000 families that are most vulnerable in New York City and hundreds of thousands more across the country. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Chase. And I agree with you, which is why we try to have the resident panel beforehand, but it is not a full solution.
My baby's bugging, so I need to run home. But I do also want to say with regard to engagement, a flyer on a lobby door is not enough. I am not even disabled, but because I work at home, I don't even leave sometimes for a week. So I do not get to see these papers. And I can't imagine people who are elderly or disabled who also stay home for long periods of time. If we can have NYCHA rent knock on our door for late rent, they can slip a paper under our door to let us know what is happening when it comes to any construction procedures.
I agree with you 100%, and I will also say for the record, 100. The P&A is absolutely not an excuse for lack of repairs. Any policy suggesting that NYCHA, or if there is a policy that NYCHA employees are saying that the P&A is the reason why they can't fix a mailbox, we have serious problems that, and we need accountability around that. And it is certainly not a reason to privatize NYCHA 100%. So we are in full agreement on the record.
I do want to add, I feel like that number is bloated now more than ever because many projects were paused. Even after COVID and everything went back to business, projects are still paused. And I'm curious if that's part of a larger plan of obsolescence to let the units deteriorate to then justify its conversion. I know people who have been waiting years for new cabinets. I just feel like there's no excuse. We've seen, as Charles Barron said, we've seen the same ideology of public disinvestment and then privatization to make up for that. But it's literally a temporary fix that ends up in permanent displacement, and it's not going to work for us. And we say no, and that's why we want to ensure we have a independent physical needs assessment, as well as much opportunities to inform residents so that they are fully informed of all their options. While NYCHA continues to call Section 9 the status quo and give the idea that there will be no changes, we don't believe we don't accept that.
I would say that language is very biased. When you say status quo and you live in an apartment that is falling apart and you have been denied or not received any adequate resources, of course you're going to choose anything else. So we need to interrogate our language for sure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ms. Glover?
Good afternoon, Chair Aviles and your colleagues. Before I read what I wanted to read, I had asked you, wrote it down on paper. The actual thing I asked was about the ACOP. That defines the policy guidelines NYCHA uses in determining eligibility for Section 9 public housing, admissions, and continued occupancy. I just happened to hear about that. Somebody sent me an email. That's how I know about it. That was like 2 days ago. The other thing I would like to say is, as a former TA president, I asked Brian Honan to stay around to hear my testimony, and as you see, he's still here. Thank you.
Ms. Glover, thank you. I'm so sorry that
No,
I
that's
did
okay.
not hear it. I did not understand the question. I
Okay.
wanted to be able to ask what you wanted, but apologies. I asked about CCOP instead
You
of
sure did.
ACOP. My apologies.
Thank you.
And I will say, the NYCHA team, while some of them leave, they have made it a point to stay. This is important that they hear directly from the residents and provide the courtesy that residents have offered by spending their time here. So I certainly, we have to give credit where credit is due, and I appreciate the NYCHA team staying around through this testimony.
Thank you. So, good morning, Chair. My name is Crystal G. Only reason why I don't want to say my full name, because I live in Washington houses. It's very dangerous over there. Our TAs are now functioning with the politicians. They have abandoned their job. They're not utilizing their bylaws, and actually, someone in the federal monitor's office, when they have those monthly federal monitor meetings, she's not only a TA president, but she's on CCOP.
Oh, Tamika.
She's on CCOP. Tamika, I think, and she told me, no, it wasn't her. It was someone from resident engagement / civic, what's it called? / civic something, but it used to be resident engagement. Now it's resident engagement, civic.
Participation?
Partnerships. In any event, hopefully I'll be able to give my whole testimony since there's really nobody else waiting to speak. Okay.
Ms. Glover, we also have people online.
Oh, okay. So, reparations simply means the payment of damages given satisfaction for a wrong or injury. The New York City Housing Authority owes its residents reparations, money, because of neglect. NYCHA stopped maintaining its properties for decades, causing them to deteriorate. For as long as I can remember, hard drugs were always sold on NYCHA property, but back then, management kept the buildings and parks and grounds spotless. We didn't have washing machines in our apartments because housing didn't allow it. We had laundry rooms. And then came crack, destroyed our laundry rooms, and NYCHA allowed it. They let it go on. Tenants didn't report their neighbors because they were afraid and wanted to live, so they kept their mouths shut. This caused dysfunction, sickness, stress, death, and even suicide. In 2018, it became illegal to smoke cigarettes in the buildings. It's even on our lease now. But you didn't, NYCHA, you didn't create a way to enforce it. I was even on the panel because I was complaining about the smoke that I was smelling that was killing me. And they asked me, would you like to be on the panel? I said, absolutely. And I was one of the people who got this thing going. Yes, tenants can call CCC and report their neighbors, but smoke travels. We can't always tell where the smoke is coming from. You allow us a voice by giving us tenant associations, resident councils, whatever they call it these days. TAs are independent and democratic, which lets NYCHA off the hook because if tenants don't like the way their boards are working, they can vote them out. Most residents don't get involved because they don't understand the value of a RA. They don't understand the value of a RA. They don't understand that tenant associations are the conduit between management and tenant. That's a lot of power. So all these excuses about I tried to call this one and did this one, I was TA president before, and I know you can get things done when you're a resident council. Okay, so they are scared, nor do the authority mingle with the residents. The authority doesn't mingle with the residents. Okay, everything is what we told CCOP, and that's the Central Council of District Council of Presidents, and we told the tenant associations, and we met with them, and this, that, and the third. Okay, it doesn't get to the residents. And unfortunately, a lot of the resident associations they haven't been educated. There's no training. Back in 2011, when I was TA president, you had organizations like Share for Life. They were, what do you call it, consultants, and they sat with us. There was so much information given to me at the time I got in. I thank you, Jesus. Okay. You go through the tenant leaders. I'm sorry, I only got a half a page.
That's okay. I want to be equitable for all the folks that are waiting online, so if you could
wrap up.
conclude.
Okay, thank you, sister.
Thank you.
You go through the tenant leaders, but some of them don't keep their tenants informed. I was told by a federal monitoring member that 95% of the TAs and RAs are not operating within their bylaws. 95%. That excludes the 5% that are doing their jobs, so don't get it twisted. To all the tenant leaders that fought, tired, got sick and died, this one's for you. Me, a resident of NYCHA, I want my reparations. You claim you need billions of dollars. 3 years ago, it was $35 billion, now it's $78 billion. You claim you need billions of dollars to piece our buildings back together. Well, you are the reason they were destroyed. You will say the tenants, oh, they're a bunch of slobs. No, some are slobs, but most of them are good, decent, wholesome people, and I'll stop here. I want my reparations. I will never forgive NYCHA. I'm tired. You abandoned me like a mother or father abandons their baby. Shame on you. Thank you, Madam Chair, for letting me finish. I could say a whole lot more, but I'll stop there.
Thank you, Ms. Glover. You can also submit testimony for the record.
So we'll bring up the next in-person panel. Again, if there are folks here who would like to testify and they have not filled out a testimony slip, please go to see the sergeants in the back of the room. Sean Campion, Daniela May, and Jonathan Rinaldi. You may begin.
Thank you. My name is Sean Campion. Thank you for the opportunity to testify. I'm Director of Housing and Economic Development Studies at the Citizens Budget Commission. I submit our full testimony. It's been a long day. I'll just give you some highlights. So NYCHA's P&A provides the opportunity to identify what's happened to NYCHA's housing stock over the last 5 years and to help plan for its future. So to start with sort of the good news, since 2017, NYCHA's addressed $10 billion of its capital needs, and that's up from less than $2 billion over the 2012 to 2016 period. And most of that increase came as a result of the PACT program. So over 30,000 residents now enjoy or will enjoy renovated units and improved quality of life thanks to the PACT program. But despite that investment, as we heard today, as Councilmember Ressler pointed out, capital needs have doubled for the 161,000 units that are still in NYCHA's Section 9 program, with 5-year needs reaching over $370,000 per unit. And we heard that inflation is due to both high inflation and the fact that, highlighting that the 2017 P&A underestimated both the scale and the scope of the work that's actually needed to bring these units back to good repair. The result is that the number of units near replacement costs, which is the cost to repair them being more than the cost to build new, has increased faster than when we first forecasted this back in 2018. About a third of NYCHA units are now at or near replacement cost, a 6-fold increase from 2017. And 57% are getting close to or might reach that point soon, which really underscores a sense of urgency of action needed to address this problem. To address the fact that NYCHA residents now live with the worst physical conditions of any residents in New York City. So what's next? To address this immense capital needs, NYCHA needs both funding and the flexibility to execute. The current plan, including both PACT and the trust, as we heard today, meets about half of the need, but without accounting for the fact that everything now is more expensive. Borrowing costs are up 50%. Construction costs increased 20 to 30%. And as a result, the loans that fund a lot of these PACT projects now cover a smaller share of the renovation costs than they did in the past. And recognizing this, the city has started to put more capital money into the PACT program as well. And this really raises 2 big questions, which I'll get quickly. First, can NYCHA ensure the process as fast as possible? The longer you wait to do repairs, the more expensive they'll be, and the more there's a chance that unexpected developments derail your plans, like happened with inflation over the last period. Right now, we're trying to balance engagement and expediency, but process itself can become a risk to feasibility if delays increase costs. And this, the state and the city should work to streamline the renovation process as much as possible and not introduce additional steps that could delay progress and investment. And the second piece, which I'll end on, is whether NYCHA can raise enough capital to execute its plans. PACT and trust projects are going to need additional sources of financing to help close deals going forward. And that's going to require hard choices about how to allocate limited and finite housing resources, including tax-exempt bonds and low-income housing tax credits between NYCHA and other needs. And NYCHA is, of course, going to unquestionably need additional capital through new development and phased redevelopment where feasible to help support its capital program. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your testimony.
Having no one else in person that has signed up to testify, we'll move on to virtual testimony. Again, for those wishing to testify and who are on Zoom, your name will be called and then you will receive a prompt to unmute yourself. The first person we'll call is Miss Dana Eldon. If you can unmute yourself and begin your testimony.
Oh, I'm coming. All right, can you hear me?
We can.
You can hear me?
We can hear you, Miss Eldon.
Oh, okay, thank you. All right, so good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dana Eldon, and I'm the president of St. Mary's Park Houses Resident Council. Who is it? I'm also the president of our resident council 501c, which we started processing earlier this year in the hopes that we can assist in a lot of things that need to be done.
Miss Eldon, I'm sorry to interrupt. This is Councilmember Aviles. Could you speak up just a little bit?
Okay, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. There's a lot of background noise here, so I apologize. Okay, it is no secret, as you've heard from others, that Section 9 is in dire need of funding to be used to ready apartments for occupancy, but also for repairs that are needed citywide. My apologies, as I'm currently hosting a grocery bag distribution, as well as homebound deliveries to residents in St. Mary's of cooked meals. I am busy, so I'll make this quick. It is my concern that funding has not been provided to cover the scope of those needs of Section 9 developments, but also the needs assessment process and the participation in obtaining these figures are questionable. There is a concern that I have regarding the use of contractors and their performances. Not only am I awaiting the replacement of our roofs here in St. Mary's, which were completed in 1959, but there are questions that I have after meeting with capital needs as to the air quality of the top floor apartments in which the windows will be sealed, as well as having the air vents shut down. I would say that the estimate of cost of the jobs of replacing the roofs has been discussed. However, with the apartments being sealed, will each apartment be given an air filter for their apartments? I can say that I would believe that because of this push of privatization of many developments, the needs assessment for the remaining development is in, can I finish please? I've waited a long time.
Yes.
In fact, it's easy to say the least. How does this figure almost double? And where does the PNA come in for the thousands of apartments that need work done that they could be rented again? St. Mary's had 6 vacancies 2 years ago and now has 73 vacancies, both Section 8 and Section 9 apartments. We are currently waiting again for our roofs, which are 40 years old, to be replaced, as well as the need for handicap ramp to the one building that is not accessible. Then Assemblywoman Vanessa Gibson awarded us $300,000 for the construction of the ramp. Until the roofs are replaced, no construction can begin towards the ramp. And until the roofs replaced, we will continue to have scaffolding that stretches 100 feet around each building. The scaffolding complicates the property views and accessibility for resident maintenance, staff operations, and daily deliveries, etc. Also, we need to replace the 40-year-old camera system as well. Recently, we had 4 shootings on our property. My residents are consumed with fear and apprehension of navigating the scaffolding. And with 1/3 of my residents being seniors, it has been daunting to say the least. It's been daunting to say the least for me to assure them that this process will take place soon. The roofs will be replaced along with adequate brick replacement done, thereby opening up the property again. And once this is done, the work on the accessible ramp can begin. In regard to Fulton and Chelsea Elliott houses, I personally have a concern regarding the voting process of both. I've spoken to the presidents of both tenant associations, as well as residents who tell different stories, if not versions, as to how they are now in the process of demolition. I pray that this council will continue to hold NYCHA accountable. And in closing, as a disabled senior, the work that we presidents put in to see that our developments are taken care of is staggering. The need for clarity and transparency regarding the PNA, as well as the need for funding for Section 9, is paramount for survival of the public housing. Thank you for this opportunity to speak for the council on behalf of the residents of St. Mary's Park houses. Thank you for your time, and I yield the floor.
Thank you so much, Ms. Eldon.
The next person to testify, Danette Chavez.
Hi, can you hear me?
We can.
Okay, thank you for being here. I'll try to be brief. There's a lot going on between the privatization of NYCHA and what's going on with the resident association boards, and I truly wish there would be meetings specifically to deal with these boards, the information or lack of information and training that's being given to help them effectively represent the members. As far as the $78 billion assessment that NYCHA has come up with, I question those claims for the simple fact that we all know rehabilitation of NYCHA is needed, and the lack of funding is a cause for the intention going towards privatization, the inability to obtain the funding needed, and also the failure to apply money that is given for specific areas within these developments. The $78 billion, although outlandish, actually works in favor of NYCHA because it is an amount that is unable to be obtained, that neither the city or the state or the government is going to supply. So it basically guarantees that there will be the privatization of NYCHA. No entity, whether public or private, should be able to drum up the costs by which they themselves shall benefit. I believe a private entity needs to be brought in to give a true accounting of the assessments and needs of NYCHA. I also believe that NYCHA should be more serious in its dealings with its resident association. I understand that they are required by mandates of HUD to enter into these agreements, but it's simply a requirement and a going through the motion. Based on the actions of NYCHA, the training being given, there's no real true intentions on having a face-to-face on equal standing negotiation towards the future of NYCHA, and that needs to change. And it will only change when these issues are brought out and put on the table. And I hope that the City Council and others will facilitate that being done.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your testimony and your patience.
The next person testifying, Jacqueline Lara.
Hello.
You may begin.
Okay, can you hear me?
We can.
I'm a resident at Fulton Houses, and I'm opposing this demolition, and I would really love for us to get a independent investigator for the accusations of our buildings, being deteriorated. If this plan goes through, what guarantee do we have that we will come back to this Section 8 base application? Because every Section 8 has a guidelines with their income. So I really don't trust NYCHA and their P&A, and I don't trust the elected TA president in our development, and they're trying to silence us. So we could show you some help over here so residents could speak and not be feared of the harassment we go through for speaking up of how we feel. And I think that vote or survey, whatever they gave, I didn't vote because it just doesn't make sense what the vote is. I do have a copy of that if anybody needs a copy of that vote so you can see the survey. It's very confusing and misleading. And it says nothing about demolition in that survey. It says construction. Construction and demolition are two different words. Construction is just, constructing a building, forcing it, making it better. But demolition is tearing down these developments. And these developments are not in bad shape at all. I've been here 21 years, and I love my home, and I would love to keep it public housing, as a matter of fact. Because we're very limited to homes, and we all have families. And this includes my neighbors, Chelsea Elliott. Thank you for hearing.
Thank you, Ms. Lara.
The next person would be Ramona Ferreira.
Hi, everyone.
Hi, Ramona. Thank you.
Lunch. I had to start eating lunch because I couldn't wait anymore. So kudos to you guys for going on so long. So I wanted to say my name is Wapuke Ini Inaru, and my colonial name is Ramona Ferreira. I submit the following testimony on behalf of Safe Section 9, a national coalition dedicated to rehabilitating and expanding public housing. First, I want to thank the council for bringing us together to discuss the physical needs assessment. Those of us that live in NYCHA are regularly disappointed by the city, the state, and the federal government. But as we continue to expand the Safe Section 9 coalition, it has become apparent to us that we haven't lost everything because unlike our neighbors in many southern states, we still have our voices, at least in these hearings. Safe Section 9 has had one ally that's been examining the physical needs assessment really deeply, and we've made it a point to ensure that all of our members understand what it is and its implications. This is a really difficult undertaking for us, and it's something that really should fall on NYCHA to prepare materials for each development so that every tenant understands what the physical needs assessment says and what it's hinting at. We know that NYCHA has been inflating its physical needs assessment numbers, like many people mentioned earlier today. And they're doing so because they truly want to push us to believe that that the only option is privatization. And I think that's something that they do really well in the press and as they lobby elected officials pushing RAD, PAC, and the trust. We know right now that the developers involved in the Fulton Elliott Chelsea houses have actually been visiting council members to make their argument. But as you heard today from tenants in that area, the needs for their homes are not something that justify demolition, and they love their community and don't want to have to go through a project-based Section 8 recertification process, which, as Diana Ayala mentioned earlier, might lead to them not returning. We simply can't afford to do that to this working class community. So I really want to highlight that while this $79 billion is truly overwhelming, and I know that ongoing conversations are going to help us get to what the real number is, it seems that only 40-something really reflect the needs that Section 9 itself has once we eliminate the funding that's going to be used for the RAD, PAC, and trust. But whatever that public housing number is and whatever that cost is when this P&A is finally fully examined, we're worth it, right? Public housing is worth it. It's worth every penny. And NYCHA is the only housing provider that is truly affordable, mixed income ranging from incomes of $12,000 a year to 6 figures. And it's odd to us that as the mayor explores changing zoning laws to create housing that will serve all New Yorkers recently arrived and those that have been here for generations, he describes things that sound like public housing, but he refuses to name it so. So we must name it, and we must ensure that any new housing being created in New York City will be public housing under Section 9. But because of NYCHA's crooked ways and the fact that we've lost any sort of trust in them, it's important that we really start looking at creating a new public housing authority. Finally, I want to note regarding the Inflation Reduction Act, we, in our lobbying at the congressional level, have been talking to our congressional delegation for New York, and there is money that's already being earmarked for NYCHA. The City Council, our congressional delegation, and anyone that cares about public housing really needs to ensure that that money coming in goes not to the trust, not to RAD, and not to PACT, but that it goes to the Section 9 portfolio. You know, NYCHA has been telling us now for years that the private market can fix it all, right? It's gonna be this magic bullet that changes our realities. And I think that it's time that we give them an opportunity to really prove their theory.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Ramona. I can't agree with you more. Public housing is absolutely worth it, 100%. Thank you. And with that, I want to thank everyone for being here today to discuss this enormous rise in estimated capital needs for our housing authority. And while there are undeniably systemic issues that paralyze the authority's ability to provide dignified housing to all of our public housing residents, I can't help but to feel after today's hearing that this administration and NYCHA has resigned itself, that Section 9 is simply a thing of the past. Between the RAD program, ever-shifting rule changes, most recently with how rents are calculated, proposed demolitions, and now public trust program, it is no surprise that the people of NYCHA believe that this P&A may be employed simply to illustrate an unsurmountable need. It follows that if the systemic underfunding of public housing is again and again portrayed to us as simply too big to grapple with, then it becomes easier to make the argument that we need to offload this precious housing stock as soon as possible. But this is a matter of perception. If we reframe our thinking, if we instead acknowledge that public housing stock is actually one of the city's greatest assets, especially during this unprecedented housing crisis, then what was once a burden becomes an opportunity. And in the words of Ms. Ramona Ferreira, public housing is absolutely worth it. And we want our federal, state, and city government to ensure that it remains a reality and that it is dignified as it should and have always meant to be. So thank you again for having this discussion with us today. And with that, we conclude our hearing.